Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a silence that comes before the end of all things. Not the quiet of empty rooms or still nights, but the kind of silence that descends when the universe itself holds its breath, when every star and every soul seems to pause in recognition that what comes next will change everything forever. It is the silence of a father watching his most beloved son raise a blade against him. The silence of 10,000 years of consequence gathering at a single point in space and time. The silence that fell over the Sol system in the early days of the year 014 of the 31st Millennium, when the fleets of the War Master Horus finally emerged from the warp and cast their shadow across the cradle of all mankind. This is the story of the Siege of Terra, the final battle of the Horus heresy, the moment when brother fought brother at the very doorstep of the Emperor of mankind, and the fate of every human being across 1,000,000 worlds was decided in fire and blood atop the ancient mountains of a world called Earth. It is a story of loyalty tested beyond endurance, of courage in the face of annihilation, of sacrifices so immense and so terrible that the human mind struggles to comprehend their scope. It is a story of fathers and sons, of brothers and enemies, of promises broken and oaths kept at a cost that defies any rational accounting. And it is, above all else, a story about the price of survival, about what a species is willing to pay and what it is willing to become, in order to ensure that it endures for one more day, one more century, one more millennium, in a universe that is overwhelmingly, relentlessly, and perhaps irredeemably hostile to everything that draws breath and dares to hope. Welcome to the Siege of Terra. Make yourself comfortable. We are going to be here for a while. Before we begin, let me set the scene for you. Because the Siege of Terra did not happen in a vacuum. It was the culmination of 7 years of the bloodiest civil war the galaxy had ever known. A conflict so vast and so destructive that its echoes shaped the next 10,000 years of human history. To understand what happened at Terra, to truly feel the weight of every decision and every sacrifice and every death that occurred during those 55 days, you need to understand what brought us here. You need to understand how the Imperium of man, the greatest civilization humanity had ever built, tore itself apart from within. And you need to understand the beings, as both human and otherwise, whose choices led to the moment when the fate of the species hung by the thinnest of threads above an abyss that yawned wider with every passing hour. Now, before we go any further, I want you to really think about what that means. Not just the grand sweep of fleets and armies and demigod primarchs clashing among the ruins of ancient cathedrals, though we will get to all of that in vivid detail. I want you to think about the common people of Terra, the billions upon billions of ordinary human beings who lived and worked and raised their families in the hive cities and hab blocks that covered the surface of humanity's homeworld. People who had known nothing but peace for generations, who had lived under the Emperor's protection without ever truly understanding the scale of the threats that existed beyond their sky. Imagine waking one morning to find the heavens themselves on fire, the sky blotted out by warships so numerous they formed a second ceiling above the clouds, and being told that everything you have ever known is about to be tested in a way that makes every previous war in human history look like a playground scuffle by comparison. That was the reality for the people of Terra when the siege began. And their story, the story of the nameless millions who stood in those trenches and on those walls, and behind those barricades with nothing but a lasgun and the desperate hope that someone out there was fighting for them, is as important as the story of any primarch or emperor. Maybe more so, because in the end, as it was their willingness to stand and fight, their refusal to submit to the darkness, that defined what the Imperium would become for the next 10,000 years. It is a story of loyalty that endures past all reason, of betrayal so deep that it cracked the foundations of the greatest empire the galaxy had ever known, and of sacrifice so total that its echoes still reverberate 10,000 years later in every prayer whispered by every faithful servant of the Imperium. To understand what happened on Terra, we have to understand what was lost in the years before the siege began. Because this battle did not erupt from nothing. It was the culmination of 7 long years of civil war, a conflict that had consumed entire star systems, shattered legions of superhuman warriors, and turned the brightest hope humanity had ever known into its darkest nightmare. The Horus heresy had torn the Imperium apart from the inside, pitting father against son, brother against brother, and friend against friend, in a war that defied comprehension in its scale and its cruelty. Before the heresy, the Imperium of man had been ascending towards something truly magnificent. The Emperor, that ageless and impossibly powerful figure who had unified Terra after millennia of strife, had launched the Great Crusade to reunite the scattered colonies of humanity across the stars. He had created the Primarchs, 20 demigod generals of unmatched ability, each the genetic father of a space marine legion, comprising tens of thousands of the finest warriors ever to draw breath. Together, these legions had conquered the galaxy. I'm bringing world after world back into the fold of human civilization, pushing back the darkness of alien tyranny and the horrors of the warp. At the head of this great endeavor stood Horus Lupercal, the first Primarch to be found by the Emperor, and the one he loved above all others. Horus was everything a leader should be: charismatic, brilliant in war and diplomacy alike, beloved by his brothers and worshipped by his warriors. When the Emperor withdrew from the front lines of the Crusade to pursue a secret project beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra, it was Horus. He chose to carry the title of War Master, the supreme commander of all Imperial military forces. It was the highest honor any being in the Imperium could receive, and it should have been the foundation of a golden age. Instead, it became the seed of the greatest catastrophe in human history. The details of Horus's fall are a story unto themselves, and we have explored them in depth before on this channel. But the essence of it was this: corrupted by the whispered lies of the Chaos Gods, during a moment of mortal vulnerability on the moon of Davin, Horus was twisted from the Emperor's most loyal son into his most terrible enemy. The corruption did not happen all at once. It was not a sudden transformation from light to darkness, not a switch being flipped from loyalty to treachery. It was a slow, insidious process, more like a poison seeping into groundwater than a bomb going off. The Chaos Gods, those ancient and malevolent intelligences that dwelt in the dimension of madness called the Warp, were nothing if not patient. But they had waited since the dawn of sentience for an opportunity like this, and they were not going to squander it with crude tactics. They showed Horus visions of a future where the Emperor cast aside his Primarchs like used tools, where humanity worshipped the master of mankind as a god, while the warriors who had built the Imperium with their blood were forgotten. They played on Horus's pride, his sense of responsibility, his deep and genuine love for the soldiers who served under him, twisting those noble qualities into weapons aimed at the very man who had created him. They whispered that the Emperor had always intended to betray his sons, that the great works beneath the palace were not for humanity's benefit, but for the Emperor's own apotheosis. Asked that the only way to save the Imperium from becoming a prison of false piety and broken promises was to tear it down and rebuild it under Horus's own enlightened leadership. And Horus, weakened by a wound that should have killed him, his mind vulnerable in ways that even a Primarch's legendary mental fortitude could not fully protect against, listened. He believed, and in believing, he fell. The War Master came to believe that the Emperor had betrayed him, had used the Primarchs as tools to be discarded once their usefulness was spent, and that the only path forward was to tear down everything his father had built and remake the galaxy in his own image. With the backing of the 4 dark gods of chaos, Horus began to gather allies among his brother primarchs, exploiting old grievances, festering resentments, and the fundamental flaws that the emperor's own secrecy and distance had allowed to take root. One by one, they fell. Angron, the Red Angel, primarch of the World Eaters, who had never forgiven the emperor for tearing him away from his slave comrades on Nuceria. Mortarion, the Death Lord, master of the Death Guard, whose hatred of tyranny and psychers made him blind to the fact that he was exchanging one form of bondage for another far worse. Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children, seduced by a demon blade and the promises of perfect sensation offered by the Prince of Pleasure. Magnus the Red, the Crimson King of the Thousand Suns, driven into the arms of the Changer of Ways after the Emperor sent the Space Wolves to destroy his homeworld of Prospero for the crime of trying to warn him of Horus's betrayal. Lorgar of the Word-Bearers, Dao the First to Turn, who had found in chaos the divine truth the Emperor had denied him. Perturabo of the Iron Warriors, the bitter architect who felt his genius was forever overshadowed and underappreciated. Conrad Kurza, the Night Haunter, whose madness and cruelty had always existed at the fringe of loyalty. And Alpharius Omegon of the Alpha Legion, whose true motivations remained shrouded in layers of deception even 10,000 years later. 8 primarchs turned traitor, 8 legions of the finest warriors humanity had ever produced, swore themselves to the destruction of everything they had once sworn to protect. And at the drop site massacre on the black sands of Istvan V, the traitors revealed themselves in the most devastating way possible, luring 3 loyal legions, the Salamanders, the Iron Hands, and the Raven Guard, into a kill zone, where they were butchered by the very allies they believed had come to fight beside them. Ferrus Manus, Primarch of the Iron Hands, and one of the Emperor's most devoted sons, was beheaded by Fulgrim in an act of treachery that still haunts the sons of Medusa to this day. From that moment of betrayal on Istvan V, the galaxy burned. For 7 years, the Horus heresy raged across the stars, consuming entire sectors in its fury. Worlds that had been peaceful for generations were reduced to ash. Civilizations that had flourished under the protection of the Imperium were ground to nothing beneath the treads of war machines and the boots of traitor legions. The scale of destruction was beyond anything the galaxy had witnessed since the ancient wars of the Old Ones and the Necrontyr, a conflict so old that their memory had become myth, even before humanity first looked up at the stars and wondered what lay beyond. Each of the major campaigns of the heresy contributed to the chain of events that would culminate at Terra. The Shadow Crusade saw the Word-Bearers and World Eaters devastate the star systems around Ultramar, pinning down Guilliman's massive legion in a war of attrition that prevented them from reinforcing the throne world. The Battle of Kauth, where the Word-Bearers turned on their Ultramarines allies during what was supposed to be a joint muster, became one of the defining betrayals of the heresy. Its underground battles, lasting for years, as loyalist and traitor fought in the irradiated tunnels beneath the planet's poisoned surface. The burning of Prospero saw the Space Wolves, manipulated by Horus into believing they were carrying out the Emperor's will, devastate the homeworld of the Thousand Suns and drive Magnus the Red into the arms of Tzeentch. The destruction of Prospero's great libraries, the greatest repository of knowledge about the warp and psychic phenomena in the entire Imperium, was a loss that would haunt humanity for millennia, depriving future generations of understanding that might have helped them combat the very forces that had engineered the library's destruction. The Ruin Storm, a massive warp disturbance created by the treacherous Erebus of the Word-Bearers, divided the galaxy in two, preventing the Loyalist legions from coordinating their response to the heresy and isolating Terra from potential reinforcements. Sanguinius, Guilliman, and Lionel Johnson fought their way through the Ruin Storm in a desperate voyage that took them to the world of Davin, where Horus had originally been corrupted, and where Sanguinius experienced a prophetic vision of his own death that he chose to accept rather than resist. The Battle of Beta Garman, fought in the strategically critical system that guarded the most direct route to the Sol system, represented the last major loyalist resistance before the gates of Terra itself. The battle was vast, involving multiple Titan legions and billions of soldiers on both sides, and its outcome was decisive. Horus's forces shattered the loyalist defense, opening the path to Terra and ensuring that nothing stood between the War Master and his father's doorstep, except the defenses that Rogel Dawn had spent years preparing. Each of these campaigns, and dozens more besides, fed into the strategic situation that existed when the traitor fleet finally appeared in the Sol system. They determined which forces were available for the defense of Terra and which were trapped elsewhere, which Primarchs could stand beside the Emperor and which were fighting their own desperate battles light years away, and how much time the defenders had to prepare before the full weight of the War Master's fury descended upon them. And through it all, through every devastating battle and every heart-rending betrayal, one fact remained constant, one terrible truth that hung over every engagement like a storm cloud over a dying world. Horus was coming for Terra. Everything else, every battle, every siege, every campaign fought across the breadth of the galaxy. It was merely a prelude to the moment when the War Master would stand before the gates of his father's palace and demand that the Emperor kneel. That moment was now at hand. The galaxy had never known a conflict of this magnitude, and as the fleets of the War Master gathered for the final push toward the Sol system, every living soul in the Imperium could feel the weight of what was coming. On a million worlds, people looked up at the sky and prayed to the Emperor for deliverance, not knowing that the Master of Mankind was already locked in a desperate battle of his own, seated upon the golden throne in the deepest dungeons of the Imperial Palace, using his unimaginable psychic might to keep the warp from bleeding into reality through the shattered remnants of his great project, the Imperial Webway. And even the most powerful being in the galaxy had limits, and the Emperor was being pushed to his with every passing day. So close your eyes for a moment. Breathe deeply, and let me take you there. Let me take you to a time when the fate of our entire species balanced on the edge of a blade, when heroes beyond counting gave their lives for a cause they could barely comprehend, and when the light of human civilization came within a hair's breadth of being extinguished forever. This is the siege of Terra, and nothing in the grim darkness of the far future would ever be the same again. Let us begin where all great sieges must begin. Not at the walls, not with the crash of guns and the screaming of the dying, but in the quiet moments before, where when two opposing forces prepare themselves for what they know will be the defining moment of their existence. Let us begin with the gathering of the storm. In the months before the siege, the War Master Horus Lupercal stood at the precipice of his greatest triumph and his deepest corruption. The years of civil war had changed him in ways that went far beyond strategy and ideology, where once he had been the brightest and most noble of the Primarchs, a leader whose mere presence could inspire loyalty in even the most hardened cynic. Now he was something else entirely. The Chaos Gods had poured their power into him like wine into a cracked vessel, and the cracks were growing wider with every passing day. He spent increasing amounts of time in a comatose state, his spirit wandering the warp, yet communing with entities that no sane mind should ever attempt to comprehend, searching for lore and power that could aid his assault on Terra while simultaneously weakening his father's spirit through psychic attacks of staggering ferocity. When Horus was conscious, he was a terrifying figure to behold. His eyes burned with an unnatural light, the combined gaze of four gods looking out through the windows of a demigod's soul. His voice carried harmonics that could shatter glass and break minds, and his presence radiated an aura of malevolent authority that made even his fellow traitor Primarchs uneasy. Abaddon, his first captain and the closest thing Horus had to a confidant in those dark days, was eventually designated as the War Master's proxy, carrying out his orders during the increasingly frequent periods when Horus retreated into the warp to pursue his own inscrutable agenda. But for all the power the Chaos Gods had granted him, Horus was running out of time, and he knew it. Robute Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines and one of the greatest military minds the galaxy had ever produced, was fighting his way toward Terra with the largest loyalist legion still at fighting strength. The Dark Angels under Lion L. Johnson were also pushing toward the throne world, having dealt with the threats that had delayed them in the galactic east. If Horus waited too long, if the siege dragged on past the point where these reinforcements could arrive, everything he had sacrificed, everything he had become, would be for nothing. Yet the Warmaster understood this with a clarity that cut through even the fog of chaos corruption that clouded his thoughts. Terra had to fall quickly. The Emperor had to die before Guilliman and the Lion could tip the scales. And so Horus gathered his forces at Ulanor Prime, the world where the Emperor had once named him Warmaster in what now seemed like another lifetime, and prepared for the final act of his rebellion. The force he assembled was staggering in its scope. The sons of Horus, his own legion, formed the core of the armada, their jade-green warships bristling with weapons and seething with the barely contained fury of warriors who had been fighting and killing for 7 years without rest or mercy. Alongside them came the World Eaters of Angron, now fully given over to the blood god Khorne, and their ranks swollen with berserkers who had filed their teeth and scarred their faces in devotion to the Skull Throne. The Death Guard of Mortarion arrived wreathed in clouds of toxic vapor, their once gleaming white armor now stained with the filth of Nurgle's blessings, flies buzzing around their plague-ridden forms as they marched in grim silence toward the transports that would carry them to war. The Emperor's children, once the most beautiful and refined of all the legions, had become something almost unrecognizable under the influence of Slaanesh. Their armor was decorated with obscene modifications, their weapons sang with the screams of tortured souls, and their Primarch Fulgrim moved among them like a serpentine god, his body transformed into something that was as much demon as Primarch, of 4 arms ending in elegant weapons that dripped with poison and promise. The Iron Warriors of Perturabo came with their siege engines and their methodical fury, the cold precision of their approach to warfare, unmarred by the more flamboyant corruption of their allies. Perturabo himself remained largely uncorrupted in comparison to his brothers, his bitterness and resentment serving as fuel enough for his war against the Imperium without the need for demonic patronage, though the touch of chaos was never far from anyone who walked alongside it for so long. His genius in siege warfare would prove crucial in the battles to come, for no one alive understood the science of breaking fortifications better than the Lord of Iron. The 1,000 sons of Magnus, the Red brought sorcerous power beyond anything the Loyalists could match. In Magnus himself was now a demon prince of Sinch, his cyclopean eye burning with eldritch fire, his mastery of the warp enhanced beyond mortal comprehension by his pact with the Changer of Ways. His sons, the surviving sorcerers and their rubric-touched automatons, represented a psychic threat that kept even the Emperor himself wary. The role of Magnus during the Siege of Terra deserves special attention because his war was fought not primarily on the physical plane, but in the realm of psychic energy that underlay all reality. While the mortal armies clashed on the surface of Terra, Magnus waged a campaign of psychic infiltration against the Imperial Palace that was, in its own way, as dangerous as any Titan assault or orbital bombardment. The Crimson King attempted to penetrate the palace's psychic defenses, but it was a moment during the siege when Magnus was a moment during the siege, 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 when Magnus actually entered the palace itself, not through any physical breach, but through the psychic realm, his spirit slipping through gaps in the Emperor's ward that the cumulative bloodshed of the siege had created. His purpose was complex and deeply personal. Part of him sought to complete his submission to Tzeentch by destroying the last of the Emperor's psychic infrastructure. But another part, the fragment of Magnus that still remembered what it had been like to be a loyal son, to be a seeker of knowledge and a protector of humanity, sought something else entirely. Within the deepest vaults of the palace, a shard of Magnus's own soul was said to be trapped, and a piece of his pre-corruption self that the Emperor had somehow preserved. Whether Magnus sought to reclaim that shard to restore himself, or to destroy it to complete his fall, is a question that the accounts do not clearly resolve. What is clear is that Vulcan, the Primarch of the Salamanders, who had made his own separate journey to Terra, confronted Magnus within the palace's psychic defenses and fought a battle that took place simultaneously in the material world and the deepest levels of the Imperium. The clash between these two Primarchs was unlike any conventional combat, a war of wills and psychic power that bent the very fabric of reality around them. The outcome was inconclusive in physical terms, but Magnus was ultimately driven back, his infiltration thwarted by the combined resistance of the Emperor's ward, and Vulcan's determination, and the simple fact that even a demon Primarch's power had limits when operating within the psychic heartland of the Emperor himself. This psychic war, invisible to most of the combatants on both sides, was in many ways the most important front of the entire siege. If Magnus had succeeded in fully breaching the Emperor's ward, the consequences would have been catastrophic beyond measure. Demons would have manifested in unlimited numbers within the palace itself, overwhelming the defenders from within, while the traitor armies pressed from without. The fact that this did not happen, that the ward held despite everything Magnus and the Chaos Gods threw at it, was as much responsible for the eventual loyalist survival as any victory on the physical battlefield. Elements of the Night Lords under Captain Gendor Scrivok, the Painted Count, brought terror tactics and psychological warfare to the coalition, and 5,000 word-bearers under the Dark Apostle Zardu Lyak served as the religious heart of the traitor force, their devotion to the Dark Gods providing a spiritual framework for the unholy crusade. The majority of the word-bearers remained elsewhere under Lorga's command, the Golden Primarch having been banished from Horus's presence for attempting to usurp his position as leader of the rebellion. Even among traitors, ambition could become a poison. The Alpha Legion had played their own inscrutable role in the lead-up to the siege, delivering to Horus a comprehensive map of the Sol System's defenses before withdrawing from the theater of war entirely. Whether this was an act of genuine support for the War Master or another layer in the Alpha Legion's impossible web of deception is a question that scholars have debated for 10 millennia. What is certain is that the intelligence they provided proved devastatingly effective in the battles to come. Beyond the traitor legions themselves, Horus commanded a host of supporting forces that defied easy counting. Millions of soldiers from the traitor elements of the Imperialis Auxilia, the regular human armies of the Imperium, marched alongside their transhuman masters, their loyalty bought through fear, corruption, or genuine belief in the War Master's cause. The Dark Mechanicum, the traitorous faction of the Mechanicus that had sided with Horus during the Schism of Mars, contributed war engines of terrifying power. Titan legions whose god machines had been corrupted by demonic possession, their machine spirits screaming in torment as entities from the warp rode their metal frames into battle. Dozens of traitor Titan legions accompanied the host, including the fearsome Legio Mortis, the Death's Heads, whose warlord-class Titans had laid waste to more worlds than most Imperial commanders had ever visited. And then there were the demons, the Neverborn, the entities of the warp that had waited since the dawn of time for a moment exactly like this, the chance to walk upon the soil of the world that the Emperor had shielded from their influence for so long. They seethed behind the veil of reality, pressing against the barriers that kept them from manifesting in the material universe, are hungry for the bloodshed and suffering that would thin those barriers enough to allow them through. This was the force that the War Master brought to bear against Terra, an army of such staggering size and power that its mere existence seemed to make a mockery of any attempt at defense. When the traitor fleet translated from the warp into the outskirts of the Sol System, the sheer volume of ships was enough to blot out entire constellations. Hundreds of capital ships, thousands of escorts, tens of thousands of transports and support vessels, all moving with the inexorable purpose of a tide that knows it cannot be turned back. Horus stood aboard his flagship, the Gloriana-class battleship, Vengeful Spirit, and looked upon the distant light of Sol with eyes that burned with fourfold power. Somewhere in that light, on a world that had given birth to all of humanity, his father sat upon a golden throne and waited. The sun was coming home, and he was bringing hell with him. But if the War Master's forces were staggering in their scope, the preparations of the defenders were no less remarkable in their desperate ingenuity. For while Horus had spent 7 years gathering his strength and corrupting his allies, the Praetorian of Terra had spent those same 7 years turning humanity's homeworld into the most heavily fortified position in the entire galaxy. And that Praetorian's name was Rogel Dawn. Dawn was not a man given to poetry or grand speeches. Where his brother Sanguinius could inspire armies with the mere sight of his angelic form, and where the Khan could rally warriors with his fierce charisma and wild joy of battle. Dawn's strength lay in a different quality altogether. He was, above all things, a man of stone, unbreakable, unyielding, incapable of deception and contemptuous of those who practiced it. When the Emperor had chosen him to oversee the defense of Terra, he had chosen the one Primarch in all the galaxy who would rather die than give a single step of ground that could be held. And Rogel Dawn had transformed Terra into a world that would demand a very, very high price for every step the traitors tried to take. The Imperial Palace itself was the centerpiece of the defense. Sprawling across the Himalayan mountains, the palace was already one of the largest structures ever built by human hands, a continent-spanning fortress city that housed the bureaucratic heart of the Imperium, in the laboratories and workshops where the Emperor had pursued his great works, and the sacred spaces where humanity's ruler had held court during the brief golden age before the heresy. But under Dawn's direction, The palace had been transformed from an administrative center into a killing ground of unimaginable lethality. Walls hundreds of meters thick, reinforced with adamantium cores and protected by overlapping void shields, encircled the palace complex in concentric rings of defense. Each wall was studded with gun emplacements, missile batteries, and weapon systems so numerous that their combined fields of fire created interlocking kill zones that left virtually no approach uncontested. The ground before the walls had been stripped of cover, seeded with minefields and tank traps, and overlooked by observation posts manned by the sharpest eyes and steadiest hands in the Imperial military. Beyond the palace walls, the defenses extended outward in layers. Trench networks stretched for hundreds of kilometers, their zigzag patterns designed to limit the effectiveness of enemy fire while providing the defenders with protected routes of advance and retreat. Bunkers and strong points dotted the landscape at regular intervals, each one a miniature fortress in its own right, capable of holding out independently even if the positions around it were overrun. Anti-aircraft batteries covered the sky in a web of interlocking fire zones, ready to shred any enemy aircraft or drop pod that dared to descend through the atmosphere within range of their guns. The Aegis, the Imperial Palace's shield network. As was something special entirely. Unlike conventional void shields, which absorbed energy until they overloaded and collapsed, the Aegis was composed of multiple overlapping layers of shielding that regenerated as fast as they could be depleted. Breaching the Aegis was not merely a matter of throwing enough firepower at it, though the traitors would certainly try. It required sustained, precisely targeted bombardment to weaken specific sections long enough for forces to slip through before the shields restored themselves. It was a system that would have made the Aegis all but impenetrable to any conventional assault. But the Aegis was only the most visible layer of Terra's defense. Beneath it, hidden from all but the most trusted members of the Imperial command structure, was something far more powerful. The Emperor himself, as seated upon the golden throne in the deepest vaults beneath the palace, projected a psychic ward of unimaginable potency across the entire surface of Terra. This telesthetic ward was so powerful that any demon setting foot upon Terran soil would risk true death, the permanent destruction of their warp-born essence, not merely a temporary banishment back to the Imperium. This meant that even if the traitors could breach the physical defenses of the palace, the most powerful weapons in their arsenal, the demon primarchs and the legions of Neverborn that served the Chaos Gods, would be unable to operate effectively on Terra's surface. Dawn was given overall command of the defense, and he exercised that authority with the methodical precision that was the hallmark of his character. The Pab Bastion, as a fortress within the greater fortress of the palace, served as his command center, and from there he directed the disposition of every unit, every weapon system, and every resource available to him. It was a task that would have overwhelmed a lesser mind, but Dawn was a primarch, and logistics was his language of love. The forces at his disposal were considerable, though they paled in comparison to the host arrayed against them. 3 full Space Marine legions stood ready to defend Terra, and each brought its own unique strengths to the defense. Dawn's own Imperial fists formed the backbone of the Astartes' defense. Masters of siege warfare, both offensive and defensive, they understood fortifications and the breaking of fortifications better than any other loyal legion. And every Imperial fist knew the layout of the palace defenses as well as they knew the workings of their own bolters, and they had spent years preparing for the moment when those defenses would be tested. First Captain Sigismund, the greatest swordsman in the Imperium, led the finest warriors of the Legion with a ferocity born not just of duty, but of a personal faith in the Emperor's divinity that burned with the heat of a newborn star.
Honestly, this is the part of the lore that gets me every single time, because you can read all the wiki pages and all the rule books and all the novel summaries you want, but nothing really prepares you for how heavy the story actually is when you sit with it. Like, I started this channel because 40k grabbed me in a way no other setting ever has, and the Siege of Terra is the reason why. It is not just a big battle, it's a story about what people do when everything falls apart. Dorn grinding himself to dust trying to hold walls while he knows he might not hold. Sanguinius walking into a fight he already knows he loses. A million regular humans standing in a trench with a flashlight gun staring down literal demons. That is what keeps me coming back to this setting. Not the power armor, not the big numbers, though those are cool too. It is the fact that underneath all the grimdark and the over-the-top madness, there are these deeply human moments that hit harder than they have any right to. But anyways, that's just my take. Let's go back to the video.
The Blood Angels, under their Primarch Sanguinius, brought a different kind of strength. Sanguinius, the Great Angel, was perhaps the most beloved of all the Primarchs, his beauty and nobility inspiring a devotion in his followers that bordered on worship. But beneath that angelic exterior lurked a darkness, the red thirst that drove the Blood Angels to terrible acts of savagery in battle, and the gift of foresight that showed Sanguinius visions of his own death at the hands of Horus. He had seen his fate. He knew how this story ended, and he had come to Terra anyway, because that was what loyalty demanded, and Sanguinius was, above all things, loyal. The white scars of the Jagatai Khan completed the Astartes triumvirate. The Khan was a warrior unlike any other among the loyalist Primarchs, wild and free, where Dorn was methodical and restrained, preferring speed and aggression to the grinding attrition of siege warfare. His white scars were masters of lightning assault, their jetbike squadrons and fast attack elements capable of striking with devastating force before the enemy could react. In the confines of a siege, the Khan's preferred tactics might seem ill-suited, but his willingness to take risks, as to strike where the enemy least expected, would prove invaluable in the desperate days to come. Beyond the Space Marine legions, nearly 1.5 million soldiers of the Imperialis Auxilia, the regular human military forces of the Imperium, manned the outer defenses. These were not superhuman warriors in power armor. They were ordinary men and women, no tougher and no harder to kill than any other human being, who had been given a laser gun and a prayer and told to hold the line against a force that included demigods and demons. The courage required to stand in those trenches, to look out at the approaching horde and choose not to run, is something that defies easy description. They were the unsung heroes of the siege of Terra, and millions of them would give their lives before the battle was done. 4 Titan legions of the loyal Mechanicum added their god machines to the defense. The Legio Ignatum, the Fire Wasps, the Legio Astorum, the Warp Runners, the Legio Defensa, the Nova Guard, and the Legio Solaria, the Imperial Hunters. Each Titan legion deployed engines of such tremendous power that a single one could lay waste to an entire city, their volcano cannons and Gatling blasters capable of dueling with starships in terms of raw destructive output. They would need every ounce of that power in the battles ahead. The Legio Custodes, the Emperor's personal bodyguard, were perhaps the most elite fighting force in the entire Imperium. Each custodian was individually crafted by the Emperor's own hand, their genetic augmentation and war gear superior even to the already superhuman Space Marines. Oh, where a single Space Marine was worth 10 regular soldiers, a single custodian was worth 10 Space Marines. They guarded the innermost sanctums of the palace with an unyielding devotion that accepted no compromise and acknowledged no superior except the Emperor himself. Captain General Constantin Valdor, the first and greatest of their number, stood ready to lead them into whatever hell the traitors brought to their doorstep. Valdor's custodians fought throughout the siege with a cold, methodical lethality that was distinct from the more emotionally driven combat styles of the Space Marine legions. Where the Blood Angels fought with passionate fury and the White Scars with joyful aggression, the custodians killed with the precise economy of beings who had been built for exactly this purpose. Each custodian carried a guardian spear, a weapon that combined a power blade with an integrated bolter, and they wielded these instruments of death with a skill that made even the most accomplished Space Marine look clumsy by comparison. Their golden armor was proof against all but the most devastating weapons, and their augmented physiology allowed them to fight for days without rest, sustaining damage that would have killed a space marine, and continuing to function with reduced but still formidable effectiveness. During the siege, the custodians were deployed primarily in the defense of the inner palace and the approaches to the throne room itself. Their emperor-forged nature proved especially potent against the warp-corrupted enemies they faced, while the purity of their creation acting as a kind of spiritual armor that made them particularly resistant to the psychological and spiritual weapons that the Chaos forces employed. Valdor himself took to the field on multiple occasions, his presence on the battlefield a reassurance to the mortal defenders and a clear message to the traitors that the Emperor's most lethal servants had not yet been committed in full. There was also Vulcan, the Primarch of the Salamanders, whose arrival on Terra during the siege added a dimension to the defense that went beyond mere military capability. Vulcan was a perpetual, one of the rare beings in the galaxy who could regenerate from any injury, including death itself. This made him effectively unkillable, a quality that proved enormously valuable in the grinding attrition of the siege, where even Primarchs could be worn down and broken by the relentless pace of combat. But Vulcan's true contribution to the defense of Terra was not his immortality, but his role as the guardian of the Talisman of Seven Hammers, a device of terrifying purpose that the Emperor had entrusted to him personally. The talisman was, in essence, a dead man's switch of apocalyptic proportions. If activated, it would not merely destroy the Imperial Palace, it would destroy Terra itself, consuming the entire planet in a cataclysmic detonation that would deny the forces of chaos their ultimate prize, even in the event of total loyalist defeat. The existence of the talisman was a closely guarded secret, known only to Vulcan and the Emperor, and its presence in the throne room during the siege added an element of existential finality that colored every decision made by the loyalist command. Vulcan installed the talisman in the Golden Throne at the Emperor's direction, and throughout the siege, he stood ready to activate it should the unthinkable occur. Think about what that means. Think about the weight of that responsibility. Vulcan was not merely tasked with fighting in the defense of Terra, he was tasked with being ready to destroy it, to make the decision that the survival of the throne world was no longer possible, and that the only remaining option was to ensure that humanity's homeworld did not fall into the hands of chaos intact. The fact that this decision was never made, that the siege ended before the talisman was needed, thus does not diminish the burden that Vulcan carried. He was, in a very real sense, the last line of defense, and the weapon he guarded was not one that could be wielded against the enemy, but only against the ground beneath his own feet. The presence of Vulcan on Terra also had a profound effect on Rogel Dawn. The Praetorian of Terra, grinding himself to dust under the weight of his responsibilities, found in Vulcan a confidant who could understand the burden he carried. Vulcan, whose own nature made him empathetic and compassionate in ways that many of the other Primarchs struggled to match, was the one who Dawn trusted enough to admit his own fragility. The conversation between these two Primarchs, one a master of defense and the other a guardian of last resort, is one of the most human moments in the entire saga of the siege. As a reminder that even demigods have limits, and that the courage to admit weakness is sometimes the greatest strength of all. The Sisters of Silence, the anti-psychic warriors known as the Anathema Psychana, added a unique capability to the defense. Each sister was a psychic blank, a null, a being whose mere presence disrupted warp energy and made it impossible for psychers to use their powers effectively. In a battle where the enemy's greatest assets included sorcerers, demon primarchs, and the demons of chaos themselves, the Sisters of Silence represented a weapon that no amount of warp-spawned power could easily counter. And finally, there was the Emperor, the master of mankind, the most powerful psyker who had ever lived. Seated upon the Golden Throne, he waged a war on a front that no one else could perceive, using his psychic might to maintain the barriers that kept the worst of the warp's horrors from pouring through the breach in the Imperial webway that Magnus the Red's well-intentioned but catastrophic warning had created. The Emperor's attention was divided. His strength stretched to its limits, but his mere presence on Terra was the foundation upon which the entire defense was built. Without him, the wards that kept the demons at bay would fail. Without him, the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that guided the Imperium's ships through the warp, would fall dark. Without him, humanity itself would be lost. This was the force that waited behind the walls of the Imperial Palace as the traitor fleet drew closer to Terra. Outnumbered, outgunned, and facing an enemy that wielded the power of gods, that the defenders of the throne world had only one real advantage. They didn't have to win. They just had to survive long enough for help to arrive, because somewhere out in the void, pushing through warp storms and fighting through enemy blockades, Reboot Gilliman and his Ultramarines were coming. The Dark Angels under Lionel Johnson were coming. And if the defenders of Terra could hold on long enough, if they could make the traitors pay such a steep price for every wall and every gate and every trench that even the War Master's vast army began to falter, then there was a chance, however slim, that reinforcements would arrive in time to turn the tide. That was the plan. Hold until relieved. It was a simple plan, as all the best plans tend to be. And like all simple plans, it would prove almost impossible to execute. But let us not leave this discussion of the defenders without paying proper tribute to the millions of ordinary human beings who would bear the brunt of the siege's fury. The Imperialis Auxilia regiments that manned the outer trenches were drawn from across the galaxy, veterans of 100 different worlds who had been brought to Terra to serve in what they were told would be the defense of humanity's birthplace. Many of them had never seen Terra before. They arrived expecting the cradle of civilization and found instead a world being transformed into a fortress, its ancient landscapes buried under ferrocrete and plasteel, its beauty sacrificed on the altar of military necessity. These were not superhuman warriors. They did not have the genetic enhancements of the Space Marines, the master-crafted war gear of the Custodians, or the psychic nullification of the Sisters of Silence. What they had was training, determination, and the knowledge that behind them stood their families, their friends, and every innocent life on Terra that depended on the trenches holding for one more hour, one more day, one more week. The average Imperialis Auxilia soldier on the walls of Terra could expect to survive approximately 14 hours of active combat before becoming a casualty. 14 hours. That was the lifespan that the actuaries of the Administratum, in their cold mathematical way, had calculated for each warm body that took position in the forward trenches. And still they went. Still they took their positions, checked their lasguns, said their prayers or curses or silent goodbyes, and faced the oncoming storm with whatever courage they could muster. Some of them would later be remembered. Most would not. Their names were ground away by the same violence that took their lives, reduced to statistics in casualty reports that grew so long they were eventually measured not in pages, but in data slates. But they held. They held because there was nothing behind them but everything worth fighting for, and nothing in front of them but everything worth fighting against. There were also the press-ganged conscripts, civilians rounded up from the hive cities and hab blocks of Terra, and given a weapon and a uniform and pointed toward the enemy. These unfortunate souls had no military training, no combat experience, and no real understanding of what they were about to face. They were bodies to fill gaps in the line, our warm flesh to absorb the blows that might otherwise fall on more valuable military assets. It was cruel, it was ruthless, and it was necessary because the mathematics of the siege demanded more bodies than the professional military could provide. Rogel Dorn knew this, and the knowledge sat like a stone in his stomach. But he ordered the conscription anyway, because the alternative was to leave sections of the line unmanned. And an unmanned trench was a traitor highway into the heart of the palace. Some of these conscripts broke immediately, fleeing their positions at the first sign of enemy activity, only to be cut down by the commissars who stood behind the lines to enforce discipline. Others, to their own surprise and the surprise of everyone around them, found within themselves a courage they had never suspected they possessed. Store clerks who had never held anything more lethal than a counting stylus picked up laser guns and fought with a ferocity that earned nods of grudging respect from the space marines who fought alongside them. Factory workers, who had spent their lives assembling components for war machines, discovered what it felt like to be on the receiving end of those machines, and stood their ground anyway, because the person next to them was standing their ground, and somehow that was enough. War has a way of stripping away everything except what matters, and on the walls of Terra, what mattered was the person beside you and whether or not they would hold. Millions of these ordinary, unremarkable, magnificent human beings would die during the siege of Terra, and the galaxy would spin on regardless, indifferent to their passing. But the fact that they stood at all, that they chose to face the darkness rather than submit to it, is the foundation upon which 10,000 years of the Imperium was built, and that deserves to be remembered. The solar war began before a single shot was fired on Terran soil, because Horus knew that he could not simply drop his forces onto the surface of humanity's homeworld without first dealing with the defenses that Rogel Dawn had spent years preparing throughout the entire Sol system. The Praetorian of Terra had not limited his fortifications to the palace alone. He had turned the entire system into a series of concentric defensive rings, each one designed to slow the traitor advance and extract the maximum possible cost from the invading fleet. The outermost ring centered on Pluto, the frozen sentinel at the edge of the system, while Dawn had transformed Pluto's moons into massive gun fortresses, bristling with weapons platforms and sensor arrays that could detect incoming ships long before they reached weapons range. The Chthonic Gate, a warp gate near Pluto that allowed ships to bypass the normal Mandeville Point translation zone, was heavily guarded by Imperial Fist's warships under the command of First Captain Sigismund himself. Any force attempting to enter the system through the Chthonic Gate would have to fight its way past some of the most formidable void defenses ever constructed. A second warp gate, the Elysian Gate near Uranus, was similarly fortified, its approaches guarded by fleet elements under the command of Admiral Halbrecht, and screened by Imperial Fist's strike cruisers and destroyers. The inner system defenses were anchored by Luna, Earth's ancient moon, which had been converted into a fortress of staggering firepower, its surface covered with weapon batteries and shield generators that could project their protection across a vast volume of space. Mars, the red planet, presented a unique problem. The schism of Mars had seen the planet fall to the Dark Mechanicum early in the heresy, and the Loyalist fleet had maintained a blockade around it for years to contain the traitorous tech priests and prevent them from joining Horus's forces. But with the traitor fleet approaching in overwhelming strength, that blockade would be impossible to maintain, and the Dark Mechanicum forces on Mars represented a significant addition to the War Master's already formidable arsenal. Horus, predictably, did not make the mistake of attacking these defenses in the straightforward manner that Dawn had prepared for. The War Master's tactical brilliance had not been diminished by his corruption, only twisted to serve darker purposes, and he brought the full weight of that brilliance to bear on the problem of breaking into the Sol system. The traitors launched simultaneous assaults on both warp gates, with Sons of Horus, forces under Little Horus, Horus Aximand, striking at Pluto, while Iron Warriors under Perturabo himself hit the Elysian Gate near Uranus. These attacks were devastating in their ferocity, but they were also, in part, diversions. While the defenders were focused on the two obvious points of entry, a third force under Ezekiel Abaddon, the War Master's first captain, along with elements of the Thousand Sons under Ahriman, our word-bearers under Zardu Layak, and Dark Mechanicum forces moved over the galactic disk to bypass the initial defensive rings entirely. This flanking maneuver, guided by the intelligence the Alpha Legion had provided, struck down into the upper reaches of the defensive spheres, where the coverage was thinnest. The White Scars under Jubal Khan had been positioned to counter exactly this kind of move, and fierce void battles erupted across the outer system, as the lightning-fast ships of the 5th Legion dueled with the heavier vessels of the traitor vanguard. but it was the actions of Magnus the Red that truly shattered Dawn's carefully laid plans. The demon Primarch of the Thousand Suns turned the Shrine of Unity, a comet that orbited within the Sol system, into a massive warp gate through an act of sorcery so profound that it tore a hole in reality itself. Through this gate, the fleets of Horus, Angron, and Fulgrim were able to jump past the majority of the defensive rings that Dawn had prepared, arriving in the inner system with a speed and directness that the Praetorian had not anticipated. On the Phalanx, the Imperial Fist's massive fortress monastery that served as the mobile heart of the system defense, Dawn was simultaneously dealing with a demonic incursion that threatened to disable the vessel from within. Torn between defending his flagship and coordinating the wider system defense, even the legendary calm and focus of Rogel Dawn was stretched to breaking point. The Solar War, which Dawn had hoped would last months and bleed the traitor fleet of a significant portion of its strength before it ever reached Terra, was over in barely 30 days. The Loyalist fleet was driven back, the orbital platforms destroyed, the lunar defenses laid waste. The remnants of the Loyalist space forces, knowing they could never hope to match the traitor armada in open battle, regrouped at the edge of the system alongside the Phalanx, waiting for the moment when they could make an effective strike against the enemy. The blockade around Mars collapsed, and the Dark Mechanicum forces, freed from their cage at last, joined the traitor host with their war engines and their corrupted knowledge. For Admiral Neora Sukassan, who commanded what remained of the Loyalist fleet, the retreat was not a surrender, but a tactical reposition. She understood, as Dawn understood, that the fleet would have its moment. When Guilliman arrived, when the reinforcements came, the Loyalist ships would be needed to help secure the orbital approaches and allow the fresh forces to reach the surface. Until then, the fleet's role was to survive and wait. The traitor armada settled into orbit above the Imperial Palace with the ponderous certainty of a predator that has cornered its prey. The sheer mass of ships darkened the sky above Terra, their silhouettes visible even through the polluted atmosphere, a constant reminder to every defender below of the overwhelming force arrayed against them. On the 13th day of Secundus, the bombardment of Terra began. The first shell was aimed at the Sanctum Imperialis, the Emperor's personal quarters within the palace complex. It was a symbolic gesture, a message from son to father that carried the weight of 7 years of hatred and betrayal. The shell was intercepted by the palace's point defense systems long before it reached its target, but its meaning was clear. Horus was done with subtlety. The time for maneuver and deception was over. Now came the time for fire. What followed was the most concentrated orbital bombardment in the history of warfare. Thousands of ships poured their munitions down upon the palace shields. Missiles and energy beams and mass driver rounds slamming into the Aegis with a ferocity that made the very ground shake beneath the defenders' feet. The sky above Terra became a solid wall of fire, the constant barrage so intense that day and night lost all meaning, but replaced by an eternal orange glow that turned the palace complex into something that resembled a vision of hell more than a human habitation. Perturabo directed the bombardment with the precision of a conductor leading a symphony of destruction. The Lord of Iron understood that the Aegis could not simply be overwhelmed through raw firepower. Its regenerative properties meant that sustained bombardment of the entire shield would accomplish nothing except waste ammunition. Instead, he focused the fire on specific sectors, probing for weaknesses, testing the rate at which different sections regenerated, mapping the geometry of the overlapping shield layers with a patience and methodical intensity that was pure Perturabo. 12 days the bombardment continued without pause. 12 days of constant thunder, and of shaking ground and splitting air, of defenders huddled in bunkers and trenches, while the sky itself seemed to be falling. The psychological impact alone was enormous. For the human soldiers manning the outer defenses, men and women who had never experienced anything remotely approaching this level of violence, the constant barrage was a form of torture. Sleep became impossible. Communication became difficult as the electromagnetic interference from the bombardment disrupted Vox channels. Morale, already stretched thin by the knowledge of what they were facing, began to crack at the edges. Imagine, for a moment, what it was like to be one of those defenders. You are standing in a trench carved into what was once a park or a residential district, surrounded by the shattered remnants of buildings that had stood for centuries. The ground shakes constantly, a vibration so relentless that it feels like the planet itself has developed a heartbeat. The noise is beyond anything you have ever experienced, not just loud, but omnipresent, a physical pressure against your eardrums that you can feel in your teeth and your bones. Dust falls constantly from whatever overhead cover you have managed to find, and the air smells of ozone and scorched metal, and something else, something chemical and wrong that you cannot identify. You cannot see the sky because it no longer exists. What exists above you is a solid ceiling of fire, a continuous sheet of detonations and energy discharges that has replaced the natural cycle of day and night with an eternal hellish orange glow. The temperature fluctuates wildly, scorching hot when a particularly close impact superheats the air, yet then bitter cold as the energy is sucked away by the void shields above. Your armor is covered in a fine grey dust that nothing can remove, a powdered residue of destroyed buildings and vaporized earth that coats everything and everyone with a uniform layer of grey misery. Your ration packs taste like dust. Your water tastes like dust. When you try to sleep, the shaking of the ground makes rest impossible, and your dreams, when they come, are filled with the sound of thunder that never ends. You have lost count of how many hours, how many days you have been crouching in this trench. Time has become meaningless. There is only the bombardment and the waiting and the grim, soul-crushing knowledge that when the bombardment finally stops, it will not be because the enemy has given up. It will be because something worse is coming. That was the reality of the first 12 days of the siege of Terra for the mortal defenders. And they endured it. They endured it because they had no choice, because surrender meant something worse than death, and because somewhere in the back of their minds was the stubborn human refusal to accept the inevitable that has kept our species alive through every catastrophe from the Ice Ages to the Old Night. But the Aegis held. Day after day, shell after shell, the overlapping shields absorbed the punishment and regenerated, their energy levels dipping and recovering in an endless cycle that Perturabo's instruments tracked with obsessive detail. The Lord of Iron was looking for the precise point where the shields could be weakened enough to allow aircraft and eventually ground forces to penetrate. He found it at Bastion 16, where the geometry of the overlapping shield layers created a narrow window of vulnerability that could, with precisely timed bombardment, be held open long enough for slow-moving aircraft to slip through. It was a small opening, barely enough for a surgical insertion of forces rather than the massed assault that would be needed to truly threaten the palace. But it was a crack in the armor, and Perturabo knew better than anyone alive that cracks, once found, could be widened. While the bombardment continued and Perturabo probed for weaknesses, the rest of the traitor leadership chafed at the delay. Angron raged in his quarters aboard the Conqueror, his world-eaters consuming each other in their lust for blood, the nails in their brains driving them to madness as they waited for the battle they craved. Fulgrim grew bored and spoke of withdrawing the Emperor's children to find amusement elsewhere, a prospect that would later come to horrifying fruition when elements of his legion descended upon the civilian population of Terra in an orgy of depravity that would scar the planet's memory for 10,000 years. Even Mortarion, patient as death itself, began to press for the ground assault to begin. Horus, for his part, spent much of this period in the warp, his consciousness untethered from his physical form as he waged a psychic war against his father that paralleled the physical siege taking place in the material universe. The War Master was searching for ancient lore, for weapons of the warp that could aid his assault, and simultaneously attempting to erode the Emperor's psychic defenses through constant spiritual attack. As the toll of this dual existence, 1 foot in reality and 1 in the madness of the Imperium, was taking its toll even on Horus. He was growing more erratic, more unpredictable, his decisions increasingly colored by the competing desires of the 4 gods, whose power he channeled. Finally, after 12 days of bombardment, the first ground assaults began. The initial landings targeted the 2 spaceports nearest to the Imperial Palace, the Eternity Wall spaceport and the Lionsgate spaceport. These facilities were critical infrastructure, the only points on Terra's surface large enough to accommodate the heavy transport ships that would be needed to land the bulk of the traitor army, their Titan legions, their siege engines, and the vast quantities of munitions and supplies required to sustain a prolonged siege. Without control of these spaceports, Horus's forces would be limited to what they could deliver through drop pods and lighter landing craft, insufficient for the kind of assault needed to crack the palace's defenses. Elements from 5 of the traitor legions participated in the initial ground assault, supported by massive numbers of traitor auxilia, dark mechanicum war engines, and hordes of mutants, cultists, and press gang civilians who had been corrupted or coerced into serving the War Master's cause. The air above the spaceports became a killing ground, loyalist anti-aircraft batteries filling the sky with fire as traitor landing craft screamed down through the atmosphere. Many of the transports were destroyed before they reached the ground, then their burning hulls crashing into the palace's outer districts in gouts of flame that consumed entire city blocks. But many more made it through, disgorging their cargo of warriors and war machines onto the blood-soaked soil of Terra. The fighting for the spaceports was savage beyond description. Loyalist defenders fought with the desperation of those who understood exactly what was at stake, contesting every corridor, every landing pad, every maintenance bay with a ferocity that surprised even the battle-hardened traitors. Imperial Army soldiers, who had never faced a space marine in combat, found themselves locked in close-quarters battle with warriors of the World Eaters and Sons of Horus, transhuman killing machines who could tear a man in half with their bare hands. The courage of those ordinary men and women, who stood their ground against such nightmarish opponents and fought to the last breath, is something that deserves to be remembered for as long as humanity endures. But courage alone could not hold against the War Master's full might. Within hours, both spaceports had fallen to the traitors, their defenses overwhelmed by the sheer volume of enemy forces pouring through the breaches in the Aegis that Perturabo's bombardment had created. The cost had been enormous, tens of thousands of traitors lying dead amid the ruins of the spaceport infrastructure, but the objective had been achieved. The gates to Terra were open, and the full weight of Horus's army could now be brought to bear against the walls of the Imperial Palace. With the spaceport secured, the real siege could begin. Yet the hulking transports of the traitor fleet began their descent, each one carrying thousands of troops, vehicles, and supplies to the surface. The transports were enormous vessels, their sheer size making them obvious targets for Terra's remaining ground-based defense lasers, and many were destroyed in the atmosphere or on approach. But for every transport that fell burning from the sky, 3 more made it through, and soon the traitor army was establishing forward operating bases and siege camps at 8 points around the palace perimeter. Chaos cultists and traitorous auxilia troops began their blood rituals almost immediately, their invocations and sacrifices thinning the barriers between the material universe and the warp, calling down demonic entities to fight alongside their mortal allies. Greater demons materialized on Terran soil for the first time in history, their forms twisting and screaming as the Emperor's psychic ward burned at their essence, but sustained by the sheer volume of blood and suffering that the siege was generating. The Dark Mechanicum began constructing siege towers and other massive war engines at their landing sites, the mechanical priesthood working with tireless efficiency to assemble weapons of destruction that would be hurled against the palace walls. Their Titan legions were the first heavy assets to be deployed, the ground shaking beneath the tread of god machines that had been corrupted by the power of the warp, their machine spirits screaming in torment as demonic entities rode their metal frames. And above it all, looking down from the orbital battleship that bore his name, as Horus watched and smiled, the siege was underway. The end was beginning. The first true test of the palace defenses came not from the guns of the traitor titans or the charges of the world eaters, but from the cold, methodical expertise of the Iron Warriors and the pestilent endurance of the Death Guard. Perturabo and Mortarion, working in a grim partnership that combined the Lord of Iron's siegecraft with the Death Lord's implacable determination, launched the initial ground assaults against the palace's outer defensive rings. The Death Guard were the first traitor Astartes to set foot upon Terran soil in force. They came wrapped in clouds of toxic vapor, the blessed miasma of Father Nurgle rolling ahead of them like a living fog that ate at lungs and corroded armor seals. Their plague weapons turned the trenches of the outer defenses into charnel pits, chemical agents and biological horror reducing Imperial army soldiers to screaming, dissolving wrecks long before the Death Guard themselves even entered bolter range. The stench alone was enough to break lesser men, a reek of decay so profound that it seemed to seep into the very soul, carrying with it the despair and resignation that were Nurgle's greatest gifts. But Mortarion had not counted on the Jagatai Khan. Despite Rogel Dawn's explicit orders to remain within the palace walls, the Khan refused to sit idle while mortal soldiers died in the trenches below. The great Khan was not a man who could be caged, not by enemies and not by allies. And the sight of Imperial army conscripts being ground down by the Death Guard's inexorable advance was more than his warrior's honor could bear. Leading his white scars in a thunderous charge aboard their jet bikes and assault craft, the Khan burst from the Helios Gate and fell upon the Death Guard like a storm breaking against a mountain. The effect was immediate and devastating, where the Death Guard excelled at slow, grinding attrition. The White Scars were artists of speed and violence, their hit-and-run tactics tearing great holes in the traitor formation before the bloated warriors of the 14th Legion could even bring their weapons to bear. The Khan himself carved a path of destruction through the Death Guard lines, and his power sword flashing in the toxic air as he cut down one bloated warrior after another with the fluid grace that made the fighting style of the White Scars so deadly. But the Khan pushed too far. Driven by the fury that was both his greatest strength and his most dangerous weakness, Jagatai plunged deep into the traitor lines, past the point where his warriors could maintain their hit-and-run advantage, and found himself surrounded by the implacable bulk of the Death Guard. His jet bike was destroyed, and the Khan fought on foot, cutting down dozens of Mortarion's sons, before a warp-tainted poisoned blade found a gap in his armor and sent toxic agony flooding through his veins. It was Sanguinius who saved him. The great angel, seeing the Khan's peril, sortied from the palace at the head of his sanguinary guard, at the golden-armored elite of the Blood Angels, descending on wings of fire, to extract their brother Primarch from the death trap he had walked into. The sight of Sanguinius in battle was something that no mortal who witnessed it ever forgot. He moved with a grace that seemed to defy the laws of physics, his great wings carrying him above the battlefield, while his blade reaped a harvest of traitor lives below. In his wake, the defenders rallied, their spirits lifted by the mere presence of the Primarch, who many had already begun to think of as something more than mortal. The Khan was brought back within the palace walls, and remarkably, his warp sickness began to fade as soon as he came within the radius of the Emperor's psychic ward, the master of mankind's power, burning the taint from his son's blood. It was a demonstration, yes, if one were needed, of just how crucial the Emperor's continued presence on the Golden Throne was to the defense of Terra. Without that psychic barrier, the plagues of Nurgle and the sorceries of the other Chaos gods would have swept through the loyalist ranks like wildfire. But the Khan's sortie, reckless as it was, had not been without purpose. The White Scars' assault had disrupted the traitor siege camps, destroyed critical supply lines, and bought precious time for the outer defenses to be reinforced. More importantly, it had sent a message to the traitor forces that the defenders of Terra were not content to simply cower behind their walls and wait for death. They would fight, they would strike back, and they would make every inch of ground cost the traitors dearly. In the weeks that followed, as the siege settled into a grinding rhythm of attack and defense that consumed lives at a rate that beggared imagination, the World Eaters unleashed at last upon the walls they had been straining to reach since their arrival on Terra, threw themselves at the palace defenses with a fury that was almost beyond comprehension. Angron himself led the assault. The demon Primarch of Horn, a towering figure of brass and blood and screaming rage who carved through fortifications like a living siege engine. His World Eaters followed in his wake, their chain axes and power weapons reducing the defenders of the outer walls to butchered meat, as they surged forward in waves of white and blue ceramites stained red with the blood of friend and foe alike. That the traditional account of the scene at the Saturnine Gate of the Imperial Palace described the Chaos Horde pausing before the walls, while Angron roared out Horus's terms of surrender. Coming face to face with Sanguinius high above the walls, the Blood Angel's Primarch rejected the demands, and the sight of the Great Angel, standing defiant against the full might of the traitor horde, was enough to inspire even the most terrified defender to stand and fight. Not a single loyalist accepted the War Master's offer of clemency. The siege would be fought to the end. And so we come to one of the great unsung heroes of the Siege of Terra. First Captain Sigismund of the Imperial Fists was, by any measure, the greatest swordsman the Imperium had ever produced. During the siege, Sigismund was given a unique and terrible assignment. While the great strategic battles raged for the walls and the gates, while Primarchs clashed and Titans dueled and millions fought and died in the trenches, Sigismund was tasked with defending the most contested choke points of the inner palace through sheer personal combat. He became the Emperor's champion, the blade that stood between the traitors and the throne. The accounts of Sigismund's battles during the Siege of Terra read like the legends of an ancient hero, and in a very real sense, that is exactly what they are. He fought continuously for days on end, fueled by a faith in the Emperor's divinity that was so absolute it seemed to grant him a strength and endurance beyond even what his space marine physiology should have been capable of. Sigismund had, in the years before the siege, what was the only barrier between humanity and was the only barrier between humanity and eternal damnation. This belief put him at odds with the official imperial truth, which explicitly rejected the concept of divinity, and it earned him the quiet displeasure of Rogel Dawn. But in the cauldron of the Siege of Terra, where demons walked and the forces of literal gods assailed the walls, Sigismund's faith proved to be something more than mere superstition. He challenged every enemy champion who came before the gates, and he killed them all. Sons of Horus captains, World Eater Berserker champions, Death Guard Plague Lords, each one fell before his blade. The traitors began to avoid the sections of the wall where Sigismund stood. In the years after the siege, Sigismund would go on to become the first High Marshal of the Black Templars, the successor, chapter that embodied his philosophy of crusading faith and uncompromising aggression. His legacy lived on in every Black Templar who took up the sword and charged into battle with the Emperor's name on their lips. Let me also speak of what Fulgrim and the Emperor's children did during the siege, because their actions represent one of the darkest chapters of an already dark story. The Third Legion, once among the most noble and aesthetically refined of all the legions, had been corrupted by Slaanesh into something that defied comprehension in its depravity. Thus, instead of continuing to fight for the palace, large portions of the Emperor's children descended upon the civilian population of Terra, engaging in acts of hedonistic excess and sadistic cruelty that would scar the collective memory of humanity for the next 10,000 years. The things they did in those civilian districts, the Hab blocks turned into palaces of agony, the mass gatherings where Slaaneshi rites transformed living human beings into instruments of sensation. These things cannot be described in detail and should not be. The depravity was so absolute that Terrans developed a deep and lasting distrust of space marines that persists to this day. Fulgrim himself, now transformed into a towering serpentine daemon of extraordinary beauty and nauseating wrongness, and moved through these atrocities like a connoisseur at a gallery showing. He had once been among the most noble of all the Primarchs, a lover of art and culture and the pursuit of excellence. Now that same obsessive perfectionism was directed toward the perfection of sensation, and no sensation was considered beneath his attention. The practical military impact of the Emperor's children's withdrawal from the siege was mixed. It removed a significant fighting force from the traitor line, but the mass suffering they inflicted among the civilian population contributed to the weakening of the barriers between reality and the warp, feeding the rituals that the traitor sorcerers were using to erode the Emperor's psychic ward. This brings us to the broader human cost that the strategic narratives often overlook. Terra was not an empty fortress. It was one of the most densely populated planets in the galaxy. Its surface covered with hive cities and industrial complexes that housed billions of people. These civilians were caught between the hammer and the anvil of the siege, unable to evacuate because there was nowhere to go, unable to shelter because the bombardment could penetrate any civilian structure, and unable to fight because they were unarmed and untrained against enemies that included superhuman warriors and literal manifestations of the darker aspects of the human psyche. The suffering of Terra's civilian population during the siege is one of those topics that the official histories tend to treat with clinical detachment, if they address it at all. But the full picture includes the tens of millions of civilians who died from bombardment, from plague, from starvation, from the depredations of the Emperor's children, from the random violence that accompanies any siege of this magnitude. It includes the refugee columns that clogged the roads behind the loyalist lines, families dragging whatever possessions they could carry through streets that were collapsing under bombardment. It includes the field hospitals where mortal medics worked around the clock, trying to save lives with supplies that were never adequate. It includes the children who were separated from their parents, the elderly who could not move fast enough, the sick and wounded who lay in the rubble and waited for a rescue that never came. I should also tell you about the Legio Solaria, because their sacrifice exemplifies the kind of courage that defined the Loyalist defense. The Imperial hunters were a Titan legion whose crews fought with extraordinary valor during the siege, deployed to hold some of the most contested sectors of the defense. For days, they stood against the advancing traitor Titans, their weapons blazing defiance as engine after engine fell. The pilots of the Legio Solaria, knowing that their position was untenable, but understanding that every hour they held bought time for the inner defenses, made a deliberate choice to stand and die rather than retreat. One by one, their Titans were brought down, each one selling its existence at the highest possible price. The Legio Solaria was effectively destroyed at the Siege of Terra. Their sacrifice was one of thousands that occurred during those 55 days, each one a story of courage and loss that could fill volumes of its own. There were also the Perpetuals, those ancient and mysterious immortals who had walked the earth since long before the Emperor revealed himself to humanity. Figures like Alanius Persson, a Perpetual who had lived for thousands of years, who had fought in wars that predated the Imperium by millennia, and who had chosen to spend his immortal existence as an ordinary soldier because he believed that the view from the front lines was the only honest perspective on any conflict. Persson had been drawn toward the Siege of Terra for years, accompanied by a small band of extraordinary individuals whose paths had converged on this moment by something that might have been fate or cosmic design. Their ultimate role in the events aboard the Vengeful Spirit added a dimension to the final confrontation that elevated it from a mere battle between father and son to something that resonated across the very fabric of the cosmos. The Iron Warriors, under Perturbo's meticulous direction, launched massive assaults against the wall sections they had identified as vulnerable during the bombardment phase. At Gorgon Bar, a critical section of the outer defenses, Iron Warriors' forces under multiple warsmiths coordinated a devastating multi-pronged attack that overwhelmed the first, second, and third circuit walls in a single savage day of fighting. The defenders were only barely able to hold the fourth circuit, and even that was achieved only through the personal intervention of Sanguinius himself, who led a counterattack with Fafnir Ran at his side that cut the head off the Iron Warriors' advance by targeting the warsmiths directing the assault. During the battle for Gorgonbar, Sanguinius accomplished one of the most legendary feats of the entire siege. A warlord titan of the traitorous Legio Vulpa was advancing on the loyalist positions, its weapons laying waste to everything in its path. The great angel, seeing the danger, took to the air and flew directly at the god machine, evading its point defense weapons with impossible grace before landing on the titan's head and driving the spear of Telesto through its cockpit. The titan crashed to the ground in a thunderous impact that destroyed an entire section of the traitor advance. Its crew dead, and its machine spirit stilled by the hand of a being who was perhaps the closest thing the Imperium had to an angel of the god they were beginning to worship. But even heroes have limits, and the siege was designed to test those limits beyond endurance. The traitor forces were not content to simply throw bodies at the walls in a straightforward assault. They employed every weapon in their corrupted arsenal, including tools of psychological warfare that struck at the defenders' morale as effectively as any bolter round. A giant projected face of Zardu Layak, the dark apostle of the word-bearers, appeared above the battlefield, urging the common people of Terra to rise up against the Emperor and swear allegiance to Horus. He promised that those who turned to the War Master would be spared the carnage that was to come. The palace guns could not silence the corporeal manifestation, and after Layak's speech concluded, it began to rain blood across the battlefield. Not water-tinted red, but actual blood, hot and reeking of copper, falling from a sky that had been torn open by the rituals the Chaos Forces had been conducting since their arrival. This blood rain was the signal that the traitors had finally completed their great ritual, a ceremony of sacrifice and dark sorcery designed to weaken the Emperor's psychic ward. 8 massive guns, designated warp-bane weapons, were activated at the sites of the beached Dark Mechanicum Arc Mechanicus vessels, their exotic munitions striking not at the physical shields of the palace, but at the fabric of reality itself, sapping the aegis of its energy and creating openings that conventional weapons could exploit. As the aegis began to falter, the traitor bombardment was finally able to strike the palace defenses directly, causing devastating damage to walls and bastions that had previously been shielded from harm. The Night Lords launched a raptor assault on the Eternity Wall, their jump pack-equipped warriors screaming down from the sky in waves of midnight ceramite, their terror tactics amplified by the sonic weaponry and psychological warfare that was the trademark of the 8th Legion. The outermost trenches around the palace became untenable, and the defenders began their first major withdrawal, falling back to the next ring of defenses, with a discipline that spoke volumes about the training and preparation that Dawn had instilled in them. The Death Guard, not to be outdone by their more dramatic allies, as deployed towers of Nurgle at the palace walls, massive siege engines blessed by the plague god that vomited streams of toxic filth at the fortifications, corroding adamantium and ceramite, alike with biological agents that defied the laws of chemistry. The ground around these towers bloomed with diseased vegetation, Nurgle's garden taking root on Terran soil for the first time, the sickly sweet stench of supernatural decay hanging over the battlefield like a funeral shroud. Inside the palace, the toll of the constant bombardment and ground assaults was beginning to show. The defenders fought with extraordinary courage, but courage could not replace ammunition, could not heal wounds, could not bring the dead back to their posts. The casualty reports that crossed Rogel Dawn's desk at the Pab Bastion grew longer with each passing day, and even the Praetorians' legendary composure was beginning to crack under the strain. In one of the most revealing moments of the entire siege, Dawn confided to Vulcan, who had arrived on Terra through his own extraordinary odyssey, that the pressure was grinding him down and that he was having difficulty maintaining his composure. For a Primarch as controlled and stoic as Rogel Dawn, To admit such vulnerability was almost unprecedented, and it spoke to the sheer weight of responsibility that rested on his shoulders. Every death, every lost position, every setback was his burden to bear, and the knowledge that more would follow, that the siege would only grow worse before it could possibly get better, was a weight that even a demigod struggled to carry. But Dawn carried it, because that was what he did. That was what the Emperor had made him for. The siege ground on, day after terrible day, and the butcher's bill climbed ever higher on both sides. The traitors continued to press their advantage, probing for weaknesses in the shrinking defensive perimeter, launching feints and diversions designed to spread the defenders thin before concentrating their forces for devastating breakthrough attempts. The Loyalists fought back with everything they had, their counterattacks becoming more desperate but no less fierce as the noose tightened around the palace. And then came Saturnine. The battle at the Saturnine Gate was one of the most pivotal engagements of the entire siege, a moment when the fate of Terra turned on the decisions of two Primarchs, who understood each other as only bitter rivals can. Perturabo, kept studying the palace defenses with the obsessive eye of a man who had spent his entire life tearing down the works of others, identified what he believed was a critical weakness in the Saturnine Gate. The defenses there were, by his calculations, inadequately strong compared to other sections of the wall, and a concentrated assault at that point could potentially breach the inner palace and bring the siege to a swift conclusion. What Perturabo did not know, or perhaps suspected but could not prove, was that Dawn had anticipated exactly this analysis. The Praetorian of Terra had spent 7 years studying his brother's methods, understanding his thinking, predicting his moves, and at Saturnine, Dawn had laid a trap. The apparent weakness was deliberate, a honeypot designed to lure the traitors into committing their forces to an assault that would run headlong into the strongest concentration of Loyalist defenders on the entire perimeter. The battle erupted as 4 simultaneous engagements, an approach Horus mandated to prevent Dawn from concentrating his reserves. Dawn was forced to make an agonizing choice about which battles he could support and which he would have to sacrifice. In one of the most painful decisions of the siege, he chose to abandon the Eternity Wall spaceport, reasoning that since the Loyalists no longer controlled the orbit above Terra, a spaceport was of limited value to them. The defenders at the Eternity Wall were effectively condemned to die fighting, and a sacrifice that Dawn ordered with the grim pragmatism that was both his greatest strength and his heaviest burden. But at the Saturnine Gate, the trap was sprung. The traitor assault force, expecting to punch through a weak point in the defenses, instead found themselves channeled into a killing ground where the full firepower of the Loyalist reserves was waiting. The battle was savage and costly for both sides, but when the smoke cleared, the traitors had been repulsed with devastating losses, and the inner palace remained secure. The trap at Saturnine was Rogel Dawn's masterpiece, the single most brilliant tactical maneuver of the entire siege, and it deserves to be examined in detail because it reveals the depth of understanding that existed between the two Primarchs who were, in many ways, mirrors of each other. Dawn and Perturabo were both masters of fortification and siege warfare. They understood the mathematics of assault and defense, the engineering of breakthrough and containment, in ways that went beyond mere expertise and approached a kind of primal intuition. But where Perturabo saw in fortifications the enemy to be broken, the puzzle to be solved, the challenge that proved his superior intellect, Dawn saw in them the expression of duty itself, the physical manifestation of the will to protect what mattered. At Saturnine, Dawn used that understanding against his brother. He knew that Perturabo would identify the apparent weakness. He knew that the Lord of Iron's pride would drive him to exploit it, to prove once again that no defense could stand against his genius, and so Dawn made the weakness visible, but subtle enough that Perturabo would believe he had discovered it through his own analysis rather than having it presented to him. It was a trap built not from walls and guns alone, but from a profound understanding of the enemy's psychology, and when it was sprung, the results were devastating. The traitor forces poured into the killing ground, with the confidence of warriors who believed they had found the key to victory, only to discover that the corridor they were charging through narrowed as it progressed, funneling them into a zone where the defenders held every advantage. Concealed gun positions opened fire from multiple angles. Pre-registered artillery coordinates turned the approach into a charnel field. Imperial fists in Terminator armor, who had been hidden in reinforced bunkers along the flanks, emerged to seal the traitors' retreat, trapping them in a pocket of concentrated destruction that reduced entire companies to bleeding ruin in minutes. The fighting was still horrendous. Even a trapped enemy fights with desperate fury, and the traitor forces caught in Dawn's trap included some of the most elite warriors in the Warmaster's arsenal. The battle raged for hours, the killing ground filled with the dead and dying of both sides, the air so thick with smoke and lass fire and the screaming of the wounded that visibility dropped to mere meters, and the fighting devolved into a close-quarters melee where the superior training and discipline of the Imperial fists proved decisive. When it was over, the traitors had suffered losses so catastrophic that entire formations ceased to exist as coherent fighting units. The Loyalists had paid dearly for the victory, but the inner palace was intact, and the morale boost of seeing the traitors beaten, truly and decisively beaten, for the first time in months, was worth more than any material reinforcement could have provided. Perturabo's fury at the reversal was immense, and the consequences of the failed assault at Saturnine rippled through the traitor command structure. The Lord of Iron, disgusted by what he perceived as a waste of his warriors in pursuit of Horus's timetable, began to disengage his Iron warriors from the most costly assaults, pulling them back into a supporting role that focused on maintaining the siege lines rather than leading breakthrough attempts. This withdrawal of the traitor's most capable siege warfare specialists was a significant blow to Horus's campaign, though the Warmaster had other cards to play. The Eternity Wall spaceport, abandoned by Dawn's forces, fell to the traitors and was quickly put to use as a staging area for their reinforcements. But the Lionsgate spaceport, the second and equally critical facility, remained in Loyalist hands, and its continued operation represented a lifeline that could prove decisive if and when Guilliman's reinforcements arrived. It was the fate of this second spaceport that set the stage for one of the most legendary acts of the entire heresy, the Warhawk's Ride. By the time the siege had ground on for months, the Loyalist situation was becoming increasingly desperate. The outer defenses had been breached in multiple locations. The Mercury Wall and the Exultant Wall were under sustained assault, with traitor forces making incremental gains that, while small individually, added up to a slow but steady contraction of the defensive perimeter. The air within the palace was thick with smoke and the stench of death, the constant bombardment and ground fighting creating an atmosphere of perpetual crisis that exhausted even the superhuman endurance of the Space Marines. But the Jagatai Khan, the Great Khan, the Warhawk of Chogoris, looked upon this desperate situation and saw not defeat but opportunity. While Dawn had been focused on holding the line, the Khan had been studying the disposition of the traitor forces, and he had identified a vulnerability that could potentially change the course of the entire siege. The Lionsgate spaceport, critical for any future Loyalist reinforcement, was held by the Death Guard under Mortarion. If the Khan could retake that spaceport, well, it would not only slow the flow of traitor reinforcements to the surface, but would also provide a landing zone for Guilliman's forces when they arrived. It was a bold plan, bordering on suicidal. The White Scars would have to break through the traitor lines, fight their way across kilometers of contested ground, and then storm a fortified position held by one of the most resilient legions in existence, led by a Primarch who had been elevated to demonic power by the Plague God himself. The odds were astronomical. The Khan did not care about odds. He had never cared about odds. What the Khan cared about was movement, about the sacred joy of the charge, about the wind in his face and the thunder of engines beneath him and the screaming of enemies before him. The Khan was born for moments like this, and he knew it. And every warrior who rode beside him knew it too. With an exhausted Rogel Dawn unable to stop him, and perhaps secretly recognizing the strategic validity of the Khan's plan, Jagatai mustered nearly the entire White Scars Legion for the assault. He was joined by the Terran First Armored, a formation of Imperial Army tank crews who had been holding the line since the siege began and were eager for a chance to take the fight to the enemy. And he requisitioned the Sky Fortress, the last operational orbital plate on Terra, a massive floating weapons platform that until now had been held in reserve for the defense of the inner palace. The charge of the White Scars toward Lion's Gate was something that would be immortalized in murals within the Imperial Palace for 10,000 years afterward. The Khan himself rode at the head of the formation, leading from the front as he always had and always would, his warriors streaming behind him in a tide of white ceramite and screaming engines. They hit the Death Guard siege lines like a thunderbolt, the speed and ferocity of their assault shattering formations that had held firm against months of grinding attrition in a matter of minutes. The Khan's forces pushed rapidly to the Lion's Gate spaceport, but once inside, the nature of the battle changed dramatically. The interior of the spaceport was a labyrinth of corridors, hangars, and maintenance bays, the kind of confined, claustrophobic environment where the Death Guard's strengths, their inhuman endurance, their resistance to pain, their ability to fight on through wounds that would kill any other warrior, were at their deadliest. The White Scars, built for speed and open warfare, found themselves bogged down in a war of attrition for which they were fundamentally ill-suited. As loyalist casualties mounted, the Khan fought his way to the heart of the spaceport, and the confrontation that had been building since the two Primarchs had first crossed blades years before. Mortarion was waiting for him. The Death Lord had changed since the last time they had faced each other. Where once Mortarion had been a gaunt, pale figure of grim determination, he was now something else entirely. The power of Nurgle had transformed him into a demon Primarch, his body bloated with supernatural resilience, his flesh crawling with the blessings of the Plague God, his great scythe, silence humming with warp energy that could sever the bonds between body and soul, wings of tattered, a moth-eaten membrane spread from his back, and a cloud of supernatural filth hung around him like a shroud, turning the very air into a weapon. The duel between the Khan and Mortarion was one of the most brutal and closely fought encounters of the entire heresy. Two Primarchs, brothers in creation if not in temperament, locked in a combat that was as much a clash of philosophies as it was a clash of weapons. The Khan fought with the speed and precision that defined his legion, his blade moving in patterns so fast that even transhuman eyes could barely follow them. Mortarion countered with the implacable endurance that had always been his greatest asset, absorbing punishment that would have killed any lesser being, and striking back with silence's lethal edge. But as the fight wore on, yet the Khan began to realize the true horror of what Mortarion had become. Every wound the Khan inflicted healed almost instantly, the unnatural vitality of Nurgle's blessing, knitting flesh and bone together as fast as the blade could part them. And Mortarion's blows, though slower than the Khan's, carried a weight and a toxicity that accumulated with every strike. The Khan was getting tired, something he had never experienced before in his life, and Mortarion showed no signs of slowing down. The Death Lord wrecked Jagatai's armor, broke his arms and ankles, and battered his face into a pulp. By any reasonable measure, the fight was over. The Khan was beaten, his body broken by the demonic strength of his brother. But Jagatai Khan was not a man who respected reasonable measures. In the depths of his agony, and drawing on reserves of willpower that even he did not know he possessed, the Khan found the weapon he needed. Not a blade, not a fist, but words. He scolded Mortarion. He mocked the Death Lord for his weakness, for surrendering to the very powers he had sworn to oppose, for becoming the thing he had always hated most. Where the Khan had resisted the temptations of chaos, had fought through every test the warp had thrown at him, and emerged with his soul intact, Mortarion had broken. Mortarion had knelt. Mortarion had become a slave to the very forces he had once pledged to destroy. The words hit harder than any weapon. Mortarion, whose pride had always been his defining characteristic, who had endured the horrors of his homeworld Barbarous, with nothing but his own strength and his own will, who had hated tyranny in all its forms with a passion that bordered on obsession, flew into a rage so consuming that it overwhelmed even the tactical acumen that the plague god's gifts had granted him. In that moment of blind fury, Mortarion telegraphed a finishing blow that a fresh warrior could have dodged with ease. The Khan was anything but fresh, but he was still. The Jagatai launched himself forward. Allowing Mortarion's scythe to impale him through the body, but using the momentum to pull himself along the length of the blade until he was face to face with the Death Lord. And then, with a single stroke of his tulwar, the Khan took Mortarion's head from his shoulders, flattening everything within hundreds of meters. Mortarion was banished back to the Imperium, his physical manifestation destroyed, his spirit hurled screaming back into the realm of the Plague God. The Death Guard, suddenly bereft of their Primarch's guiding will, faltered. The Khan collapsed, his wounds so catastrophic that the White Scars who found him were certain he was dead. The sight of their fallen Primarch sent the Scars into a frenzy of grief and rage, and they threw themselves at the leaderless Death Guard with a savagery that surprised even the plague-hardened warriors of the 14th Legion. Without Mortarion to coordinate their defense, the Death Guard were gradually pushed back, and the White Scars secured the Lion's Gate spaceport for the Loyalists. The Khan did not die. His body, shattered almost beyond recovery, was carried to safety by Ilya Revalian and Jangsai Khan, and Malkador the Sigillite himself labored to draw the Khan's spirit back from the edge of oblivion. The Warhawk would live, though it would take time, and no small amount of the Sigillite's dwindling psychic reserves to achieve it. But the Khan's sacrifice had achieved its goal. The Lion's Gate spaceport was in Loyalist hands. The Death Guard had been dealt a blow from which they would not recover during the siege, and a landing zone was now secure for whatever reinforcements might arrive from beyond the Sol system. Somewhere out in the void, the fleets of Guilliman and the Lion were drawing closer, as guided by the light of the Astronomicon that still burned thanks to the Emperor's continued sacrifice upon the Golden Throne. The news that was most desperately awaited came to Sanguinius in a vision, and to Admiral Sue Casson through her long-range sensors almost simultaneously. Signals from the outer edges of the Sol system were detected, and a hail from Corswin of the Dark Angels confirmed what the defenders had been praying for. Reinforcements were coming. The Lion was on his way, with the Ultramarines not far behind. The arrival of these signals was a moment that those who experienced it would remember for the rest of their lives. For months, the defenders of Terra had been fighting with no certainty that anyone was coming to help them, no guarantee that their sacrifice would amount to anything more than a delay in the inevitable. And they had held the line on faith, on duty, on the simple refusal to stop fighting, even when every rational analysis suggested that the siege could only end one way. And now, after all those months of blood and suffering and grinding attrition, a voice from the void spoke the words that changed everything. Corsin's message was simple: "We come to stand with Terra." 5 words that carried more weight than any speech, any prayer, any battle cry that had been uttered during the entire siege. The Dark Angels were coming. Guilliman's Ultramarines were coming. The balance of the war was about to shift, and everyone on both sides of the conflict knew it. For the Loyalists, the news was a shot of pure adrenaline injected directly into the heart of a defense that had been running on fumes and faith for longer than anyone cared to remember. Marines who had been fighting continuously for weeks, their armor cracked and their ammunition nearly depleted, straightened their backs and tightened their grips on their weapons. Mortal soldiers who had been counting the minutes until the next enemy assault came felt something shift in their chests, a loosening of the iron band of despair that had been tightening for months. It was not relief, not exactly, because the siege was far from over and the worst fighting might still be ahead. But it was hope, and hope was something that no amount of fortification or firepower could replace. For Horus, the news was a countdown to failure. The War Master had always known that time was not on his side, that the siege needed to be resolved before Loyalist reinforcements could arrive in sufficient strength to tip the balance. He had gambled that the overwhelming force of his initial assault would break the palace's defenses quickly enough to render reinforcements irrelevant. That gamble had failed. The walls had held far longer than anyone had expected. The defenders had fought with a tenacity that had ground down even the most enthusiastic traitor assaults, and now the clock was running out. Sanguinius, whose prescient visions had already shown him glimpses of what was to come, understood the significance of the moment in ways that went beyond mere military strategy. His visions had shown him the destruction of Nuceria, Angron's homeworld, a world that Angron and Lorgar had devastated during the Shadow Crusade years before. But the destruction Sanguinius saw was fresh, recent, an orbital bombardment on a scale that could only mean one thing. Guilliman had passed through the system on his way to Terra and had obliterated the world that had caused Angron so much pain as a statement of intent. It was not a subtle message. It said, clearly and unmistakably, "We are coming, and we are angry." The detection of Guilliman's fleet through Sanguinius's prescience and Sukassen's sensors created a strategic dynamic that would define the final phase of the siege. Horus now had a hard deadline. Every hour that passed without the palace falling was an hour closer to the arrival of forces that would overwhelm his already fragmenting army. The War Master needed to force a decision, and he needed to force it now. Thus it was this desperation that drove Horus to lower the void shields of the vengeful spirit and issue his challenge to the Emperor. It was not an act of confidence, but an act of necessity, the move of a general who knows that his position is deteriorating and that only a dramatic stroke can prevent defeat. Horus was betting everything on a single confrontation, father against son, the ultimate resolution to a conflict that had consumed the galaxy for 7 years. If he could kill the Emperor, the arrival of Guilliman and the Lion would be irrelevant. The Imperium without the Emperor would fracture, the Astronomicon would fail, and chaos would consume what remained. If he failed, it was over anyway. It was the greatest gamble in the history of warfare, and both sides knew the stakes. As the siege entered its final, most desperate phase, reality itself began to break down around the Imperial Palace. The constant bloodshed, the rituals of the traitor sorcerers, the cumulative weight of suffering and death that had soaked into Terra's soil over months of fighting, had thinned the barriers between the material universe and the warp to a degree that had not been seen since the fall of the Aeldari. Time became unreliable. Hours would pass as if they were weeks in some parts of the battlefield, while in others, entire days would compress into moments. The laws of physics, already strained by the presence of so many psychers and demons, began to fray at the edges, creating pockets of impossible geometry and temporal distortion that drove mortal men mad. Demons manifested in numbers that beggared belief. The Emperor's psychic ward, once strong enough to cover all of Terra, and Palace but beyond its shrinking radius. Palace, but beyond its shrinking radius, the Neverborn walked freely, and the horrors they brought with them defied description. Legendary demon entities of terrible power, greater demons and demon princes, whose names had been whispered in fear since the dawn of civilization, manifested on Terran soil. The fighting inside the palace walls reached a fever pitch. The World Eaters, now completely beyond any pretense of military discipline, rampaged through the corridors and galleries of the outer palace, killing everything in their path, friend and foe alike, in their insatiable hunger for blood. The sons of Horus pushed toward the Sanctum Imperialis, in the innermost heart of the palace where the Emperor sat upon the golden throne, sensing that final victory was within their grasp. Angron led his berserkers in a rampage through the Palatine district, his demon form leaving a trail of destruction that rivaled the output of a Titan legion. The Loyalist defense was fragmenting. Communication between units had become almost impossible. The warp interference disrupting Vox channels and psychic communication alike. Individual units fought in isolation, cut off from the broader command structure, relying on their own initiative and the training that had been drilled into them over years of preparation. Some held their ground with incredible tenacity. Others broke and fled, only to find that there was nowhere to flee to. Rogol Dawn, besieged in the Bab Bastion by sons of Horus forces, was eventually forced to abandon his command center and retreat into the Sanctum Imperialis itself. For the Praetorian of Terra, the man who had sworn never to give ground that could be held, this retreat was a wound deeper than any blade could inflict. But Dawn was, above all things, a realist, and he understood that the defense of the palace was no longer about holding walls and gates. It was about holding on long enough for one final roll of the dice. That roll came from the Emperor himself. But before we reach that climactic moment, we need to understand how desperate the situation had become in the final days of the siege. The palace was dying. That is the only way to describe what was happening within its walls. The outer rings of defense had been overwhelmed, yet the walls breached in so many places that the concept of a defensive perimeter had become almost meaningless. The Eternity Gate, the final physical barrier between the traitors and the inner sanctum of the palace, where the Emperor sat upon the golden throne, had been sealed by Sanguinius himself in a moment of grim finality that told every defender inside exactly how bad things had become. The scene at the Eternity Gate in those final hours was one that survivors would describe for generations afterward. Though few would hear their accounts without weeping, Sanguinius stood before the gate, his golden armor cracked and stained with the blood of 100 battles, his great wings tattered and torn by weeks of constant combat, his beautiful face drawn with the exhaustion that even a Primarch could not entirely conceal. Behind him, as pressed into the cramped corridors and chambers of the inner palace, were the remnants of the Loyalist force. Space Marines of 3 legions, many of them wounded, all of them running low on ammunition, and the spiritual reserves that had kept them fighting far past the point of rational endurance. Custodians in their golden armor, their numbers reduced to a fraction of what they had been at the start of the siege. Sisters of Silence, their blank auras creating islands of psychic calm in an ocean of warp-spawned madness. And everywhere, mixed in among the superhuman warriors, the mortal soldiers who had somehow survived everything that the traitors had thrown at them, their faces grey with dust and shock, and the peculiar numbness that comes from experiencing too much horror in too short a time. Before the sealed gate, Sanguinius organized a defense with the calm efficiency of a man who has accepted his own death and found that acceptance liberating rather than paralyzing. At dawn, if dawn meant anything anymore in the perpetual hell glow that had replaced Terra's sky, the traitors erected their war trophies. Loyalist prisoners, captured during the fighting, had been nailed to makeshift crosses, banners, vehicles, and anything else that could be made into an instrument of display and torment. They were still alive, most of them, their screams adding to the cacophony of battle sounds that had become the constant soundtrack of the siege. It was a deliberate act of psychological warfare, designed to break the spirit of the defenders before the final assault even began. A Reaver Titan of the traitorous Legio Mordaxis, the Daughter of Torment, strode forward through the rubble-choked streets, and in its massive power claw was the tortured but still living form of a Blood Angels captain named Idamas. Through amplified speakers that shook the very stones of the palace, it broadcast Horus's terms. Any who fled the coming battle would be granted a pardon by Horus, new emperor of mankind. Any who laid down their arms would be spared. Sanguinius, standing upon the rubble of a once magnificent colonnade, responded with a speech that those who heard it would never forget. He said that he would stand and fight, here, now, at this gate, but that all others were free to go where they wished. He would not compel any man or woman to die beside him. He would not demand that others share his fate, but he, Sanguinius, the angel of Baal, would not yield one more step. It is believed that not a single loyalist took Horus's offer. Whether this was because Sanguinius's words inspired them to heights of courage they did not know they possessed, or because they were simply too proud or too stubborn or too angry to kneel before the forces that had destroyed their world, or because they looked at the angel standing before them and decided that if death was coming, they could do worse than to die in such company, is a question that historians and theologians have debated for 10,000 years. Perhaps it was all of these things. Perhaps it was something simpler. Perhaps it was just that ordinary, everyday, magnificent human stubbornness that makes our species what it is. The Eternity Gate held. Against everything that was thrown against it, against demon and traitor and the full, an unfettered fury of a dozen Titan legions, the Eternity Gate held. The defenders paid for every moment of its defiance in blood and lives, the casualty rate climbing to levels that would have been considered catastrophic in any other conflict, but were simply the cost of doing business in the arithmetic of the siege of Terra. But the gate held, and while it held, hope remained. It was during these final, desperate hours that the nature of the conflict began to change in ways that defied conventional military analysis. The traitor forces, which had begun the siege as a disciplined, if diverse, military coalition, were disintegrating from within. The longer the siege dragged on, the more the corrupting influence of chaos eroded the command structures and unit cohesion that had made the traitor legions such effective fighting forces. The World Eaters had long since ceased to function as a coherent military formation, their warriors now little more than individual berserkers who attacked anything that moved, including their own allies. The Emperor's children had largely abandoned the siege altogether, their warriors scattering into the civilian districts of Terra to pursue the depraved pleasures that Slanesh whispered were so much more interesting than mere conquest. The Night Lords and elements of the Iron Warriors had similarly withdrawn from the heaviest fighting, their pragmatic leadership recognizing that the siege was no longer a military operation, but a descent into madness. Even Perturabo, the most methodical and disciplined of the traitor primarchs, had pulled back his Iron Warriors from the forefront of the assault. But the Lord of Iron had achieved what he had come to achieve. The walls were broken, the defenses were crumbling. The mathematical certainty of the palace's fall was, in his estimation, only a matter of time. But Perturabo was not interested in being consumed by the warp-spawned insanity that was swallowing his allies. He withdrew to the siege lines, maintained his positions, and waited with cold patience for the inevitable conclusion, content to let others waste their lives in the final, bloody convulsions of the battle. The only truly organized force still pressing the attack was the sons of Horus themselves, driven by their loyalty to their Primarch and the knowledge that everything depended on breaking through to the Emperor before reinforcements arrived. But even the sons of Horus were fraying at the edges, their discipline eroded by the warp energies that saturated the battlefield and the increasing absence of their war master, who spent more and more time in the Imperium, his body comatose on the bridge of the vengeful spirit, while his spirit fought battles in the realm of chaos. Horus, sensing that his window of opportunity was closing, made a decision that would determine the fate of the galaxy. He lowered the void shields of the vengeful spirit. The gesture was an invitation, a challenge, and a trap all at once. Horus was offering the Emperor a chance to face him in single combat, to settle the war between father and son with one final confrontation. It was also a calculated risk, because Horus knew that the Emperor could not resist the challenge. The battle on the surface was lost. The outer palace had fallen, while demons roamed the corridors of the sanctum. Within hours, perhaps less, the traitors would reach the Golden Throne, and all would be over. The only chance left, the only move that could still change the outcome of the siege, was for the Emperor to leave the throne and face Horus directly. But leaving the throne meant someone else had to take his place. The Golden Throne was not merely a life support system or a psychic amplifier. It was the dam that held back the full tide of the warp from flooding through the broken webway gate beneath the palace. Without someone of sufficient psychic power sitting upon it, the gate would burst open and Terra itself would be consumed by a demon invasion that would make the siege look like a border skirmish. The Emperor's original choice for a replacement had been Magnus the Red, whose psychic power was second only to the Emperor's own. But Magnus had sided with Horus had become a demon prince of Sinch and was currently using his vast sorcerous abilities to assail the palace's psychic defenses from the warp. There was only one other being in the Imperium with the psychic strength to hold the throne, even temporarily. Malcador, the Sigillite, the first Lord of Terra, the Emperor's oldest friend and most trusted advisor. A man who had walked beside the Master of Mankind since before the Unification Wars, who had helped build the Imperium from the ashes of old Earth, who had founded the institutions that would govern humanity for millennia to come. Malcador was arguably the most powerful human psyker alive, perhaps the third most powerful after the Emperor and Magnus. But most powerful human psyker was still infinitely less than what the Golden Throne demanded. Taking the Emperor's place upon the throne would kill Malcador. They both knew it. There was no ambiguity, no hope for a miraculous survival. Sitting on the Golden Throne would consume Malcador body and soul, burning through his psychic reserves like a candle thrown into a furnace. Malcador accepted without hesitation. The scene in the throne room, as recorded in the scattered and fragmentary accounts that survive, was one of the most poignant moments in all of human history. Two ancient friends, who had shared a bond that spanned millennia, said their farewells in the knowledge that they would never speak again. The Emperor, who had created Primarchs and conquered galaxies, but who had shaped the destiny of an entire species with his will and his vision, looked upon this mortal man who had been his companion through all of it, and spoke three words that echoed through eternity. He declared that Malcador the Sigillite was no more, and that henceforth he would be known only and forever as Malcador the Hero. Malcador ascended the Golden Throne, and the agony hit him like a wave of fire that consumed every nerve in his body simultaneously. The power of the warp, the ceaseless pressure of entities beyond number trying to force their way through the webway gate, crashed against his psychic defenses with a force that would have instantly killed any lesser being. Malcador screamed and screamed again, and held still. Or Malcador sent one final psychic message to the Emperor, imploring him to take the throne and lead the Imperium to victory. The Emperor hesitated, but in the end, he agreed to take the throne and lead the Imperium to victory. Malcador sent one final psychic message to each of his chosen, the knights errant he had recruited throughout the heresy, agents who would go on to found the institutions, the Inquisition, and the Grey Knights, that would protect humanity from the threats of chaos for the next 10,000 years. Even in the moment of his greatest sacrifice, Malcador was thinking of the future, planting seeds that would grow into the shields of a civilization he would never see. Free from the burden of the Golden Throne, for the first time in years, the Emperor rose. The Master of Mankind had been fighting a war on multiple fronts for so long that his physical form had suffered terribly. Years of sitting upon the throne, channeling psychic energy of a magnitude that defied comprehension, had left him gaunt and haggard, a far cry from the golden demigod who had once led the Great Crusade at the head of his legions. But the power that burned within him was undimmed, and when he stood, the very foundations of the palace seemed to tremble with the force of his presence. He gathered his most elite warriors for the assault on the vengeful spirit. The Primarchs Sanguinius and Rogel Dawn would accompany him, along with a hand-picked force of custodians, Imperial Fists, and Blood Angels in Terminator armor, the finest warriors available for what they all understood might be a one-way mission. There were also others who would find their way aboard the vengeful spirit through different paths. Figures whose presence in the final confrontation would carry significance that would resonate across 10 millennia. The teleportation to the vengeful spirit was rough. The warp interference that saturated the space around Terra, distorting the transfer and scattering the loyalist force throughout the massive warship. This was not accidental. Horus, his mind merged with the power of 4 chaos gods, had used his warp-fueled abilities to deliberately disrupt the teleportation, separating the Emperor from his companions and forcing each group to fight its way through the corrupted vessel independently. The vengeful spirit had been Horus's home for 2 centuries, the ship from which he had commanded the Great Crusade and launched the heresy. But the vessel the Loyalists found themselves aboard bore little resemblance to the flagship it had once been. The warp had seeped into every surface, every corridor, every chamber. The walls pulsed with a nauseating organic quality, as if the ship itself had become a living thing, a creature of flesh and metal that responded to the will of its master. Demons roamed freely through its corridors, and the crew, those who had not been devoured or transformed, moved with the jerky, vacant motions of beings who were no longer entirely in control of their own bodies. Each group of Loyalists fought a desperate battle through the vengeful spirit, carving a path through demons, corrupted crew members, and traitor Astartes as they searched for the bridge where Horus waited. Yet the interior of the ship had been transformed by months of exposure to the concentrated power of 4 chaos gods into something that barely resembled a vessel of human construction. Corridors twisted into impossible geometries. Walls breathed and bled. The metal itself seemed to be alive, hostile, aware of the Loyalist intrusion and actively working to hinder their progress. In some sections, the ship's original layout had been completely overwritten by the warp, replaced by nightmarish landscapes that belonged to the realm of demons rather than the material universe. Loyalists reported fighting through corridors that extended infinitely, through chambers where gravity reversed itself without warning, through spaces where time itself became unreliable, where a warrior might take a single step and find that hours had passed, or where an entire battle might be compressed into a heartbeat. The casualties were horrendous. Custodians who had served the Emperor since the Unification Wars fell to demonic blades. Space Marines who had survived 7 years of the most brutal civil war in human history were cut down in corridors that seemed to shift and twist around them, as if the ship itself was trying to consume them. Among those who made their way aboard the vengeful spirit through paths of their own were figures whose presence on the ship carried significance that went beyond their military capability. Garviel Loken, former captain of the Sons of Horus's 10th Company and one of the first Loyalists within the 16th Legion to recognize Horus's corruption, had spent years fighting his way back toward the moment he knew was coming. Loken had been one of the Mournival, Horus's inner circle of trusted advisors, and he had watched from the inside as the man he loved and admired above all others was slowly devoured by the thing that chaos made of him. Left for dead on Istvan III, driven to the edge of madness by the betrayal and the violence, Loken had been rescued by Malkador's knights errant and spent the years of the heresy carrying out the Sigillites' most dangerous missions. Now, in the final hours, Loken returned to the ship that had been his home for 2 centuries. He walked the corridors of the vengeful spirit, not as a conqueror or an avenger, but as a ghost, returning to haunt the place of his own death. The ship he had known, the proud flagship of the Lunar Wolves and then the Sons of Horus, was gone, replaced by a vessel of living nightmare that bore only the faintest resemblance to the warship it had once been. Loken fought his way through the corrupted hallways with a grim determination that was less about survival and more about bearing witness, about being present at the end of a story that had begun on this very ship, when Horus Lupercal had first been named War Master. The journey of these individuals through the vengeful spirit, each one pursuing their own path toward the bridge where fate awaited, created a narrative within a narrative that elevated the final confrontation from a mere military engagement to something approaching myth. These were not just soldiers following orders, they were pilgrims approaching a shrine, witnesses gathering for a moment that would define the meaning of human existence for the next 10,000 years. And each of them knew on some level that they were walking towards something that would change them forever if they survived long enough to reach it. It was Sanguinius who reached Horus first. The great angel, driven by his prescient visions and his unmatched speed, had fought his way through the vengeful spirit with a combination of fury and grace that left a trail of destroyed demons and dead traitors in his wake. He arrived at the bridge of the vengeful spirit alone, exhausted and wounded from his battles aboard the ship and on Terra below, to find his brother Horus waiting for him. While at the scene that unfolded on the bridge of the vengeful spirit, was the culmination of a tragedy that had been building since Horus first fell to chaos on the poisoned moon of Davin. Two brothers, who had once been the closest of friends among all the Primarchs, who had shared campaigns and confidences, and the deep bond that can only exist between beings created from the same father's legacy, now faced each other across a bridge stained with the residue of warp corruption, with nothing left between them but the choice that had always been coming. Horus, radiating the combined power of four chaos gods, his form barely containable in its physical shell, his eyes burning with an unholy light that could strip the sanity from mortal minds, offered Sanguinius one final chance to join him, one final chance to turn his back on the Emperor, is to accept the inevitability of Chaos's victory, to save himself from the death that his visions had promised was waiting for him on this very ship. Sanguinius refused. He refused because he was Sanguinius, because loyalty was not something that could be negotiated or compromised, because the father he served, for all his flaws and his secrets and his terrible grandeur, represented something worth dying for. Because the alternative, a galaxy consumed by chaos, every human soul reduced to a plaything for the dark gods, was a fate worse than any death. And because he had always known this was how it would end. For years, the curse of foresight had shown Sanguinius this moment. In his visions, he had seen this bridge, this brother, this choice. He had seen his own death, not as a possibility, but as a certainty, as fixed and inevitable as the orbit of a planet around its star. Other Primarchs might have raged against such a fate, might have sought to change it or avoid it, or at least die cursing the injustice of it all. Sanguinius did not rage. He accepted. And in his acceptance, he found a kind of peace that was, in its own way, the most defiant act of the entire heresy. He went into that fight, knowing he would lose, knowing he would die. And he went anyway, because the man his father had made him to be could not have done otherwise. That is what loyalty looks like when it is tested to destruction. That is what devotion means when it costs everything you have and everything you are. The fight between Sanguinius and Horus was not a duel in any traditional sense. It was a collision of absolutes, two primordial forces meeting in a space too small to contain them. Sanguinius fought with everything he had, every ounce of his prodigious skill and supernatural power, and for brief, shining moments, he seemed to have the upper hand. There are accounts, fragmentary and contested, that suggest Sanguinius actually landed a critical blow that cracked Horus's armor, a wound that would later prove significant in the Emperor's own confrontation with the War Master. But Horus was not fighting alone. The power of four gods flowed through him like a river of dark fire, and no single being, not even one as mighty as Sanguinius, could stand against that tide indefinitely. The War Master, in his limitless malice, ensured that Sanguinius's death was not swift. He tortured his brother, breaking him slowly, and savoring the destruction of the one Primarch he had once loved above all others. When the end came, it came with a finality that sent psychic shockwaves rippling through the warp. Shockwaves that the Blood Angels would feel across the galaxy. Shockwaves that would echo in their gene seed for the next 10,000 years as the Black Rage, a madness that would cause Blood Angels to relive their father's final moments of agony in battle for all eternity. Sanguinius, the great angel, the brightest one, was dead. When the Emperor arrived on the bridge of the vengeful spirit, he found what his heart had feared and his foresight had warned him was inevitable. The broken body of Sanguinius, his most beloved son, lying at the feet of the creature that had once been his most trusted general. The sight struck the Emperor with a grief so profound that even his superhuman emotional control wavered. For a moment, the most powerful being in the galaxy was speechless, overcome by a sorrow that transcended the merely physical and cut to the very core of his ancient, unfathomable soul. Horus looked upon his father and mocked him. The War Master, swollen with the power of the dark gods, proclaimed himself the rightful ruler of humanity, claiming to have even bound the chaos gods to his will. It was a lie, of course. Horus was no master of chaos, but its most useful puppet, a vessel through which the ruinous powers acted to achieve their true goal, not the conquest of the Imperium, but the breaking of the Emperor, the one being in the galaxy with the power to threaten their dominion over the Imperium. The Emperor looked upon his son with pity and with sorrow, and he spoke the truth that Horus could no longer bear to hear, that the War Master had not enslaved the Chaos Gods, that he was their slave, their tool, their weapon, aimed at the heart of everything the Emperor had built for humanity's sake. And then, the final duel of the Horus heresy began. The battle between the Emperor of Mankind and the War Master Horus Lupercal was a conflict that existed on multiple planes of reality simultaneously. In the physical world, two superhuman beings clashed with weapons of terrible power. Power sword against lightning claw, psychic might against warp-spawned corruption. The crash of their blows reverberating through the very hull of the vengeful spirit. In the Immerterium, two consciousnesses of incalculable power waged a war of wills that shook the foundations of the warp itself, the chaos gods pouring their essence through Horus, while the Emperor drew upon the deepest wells of his own psychic might. The duel was not merely a physical confrontation. It was a debate conducted in violence, a philosophical argument expressed through the medium of weapons and wills. Every blow carried meaning beyond its kinetic force. When the Emperor struck, he struck with the weight of a dream, the vision of a united humanity that had driven him for millennia. When Horus parried, he parried with the bitterness of a son who believed himself betrayed, the resentment of a warrior who had been asked to sacrifice everything and then told that even his sacrifice was not enough. The two combatants knew each other more intimately than any two beings in the galaxy, and that intimate knowledge made every exchange a wound that went deeper than mere flesh. The vengeful spirit trembled around them. The ship, already corrupted beyond recognition by the warp energies that saturated its every surface, began to resonate with the psychic forces being unleashed on its bridge. Walls buckled and reformed. Corridors stretched and contracted in rhythm with the psychic tides. The demons that had infested the vessel fled from the bridge, unable to withstand the proximity of two such overwhelming presences locked in mortal combat. Even chaos had its limits, and the clash between the Emperor and Horus was pushing against the very boundaries of what reality could sustain. In the warp, as the chaos gods watched with the hungry anticipation of predators closing in on their prey, they fed their power into Horus with reckless abandon, pouring 10,000 years of accumulated malice through the conduit of the War Master's body. Horn gifted him with a strength that could shatter mountains. Tzinch granted him a cunning that could outmaneuver fate itself. Nurgle blessed him with an endurance that laughed at mortal limitations. Slanesh gave him a speed and grace that turned every movement into a killing stroke. The four gods had never before united their power so completely, had never before agreed on anything with such perfect unanimity. But the destruction of the Emperor was a goal that transcended even their eternal rivalries, and for this one moment in cosmic history, they acted as one. But the Emperor was holding back. For all that Horus had done, for all the worlds burned and lives destroyed, for all the betrayal and the corruption and the incalculable suffering that the heresy had inflicted upon the galaxy, the Emperor could not bring himself to kill his son, not because he lacked the power, but because some part of him still hoped, still believed that the boy he had raised, the Primarch he had loved above all others, could be saved, could be reached through the layers of corruption and brought back to the light. This hesitation cost the Emperor dearly. Horus, suffering no such sentimental restraint, pressed his attack with the combined might of four gods, and the Emperor began to fall. Blow after blow landed on the Master of Mankind, each one carrying the weight of demonic power that tore at his body and his soul. The Emperor's armor was shattered. His bones were broken. The warp energy that Horus channeled burned through his physical form with a cruelty that was deliberate and almost surgical in its precision. The Chaos Gods were savoring their moment, the moment when the one being who had stood between them and total dominion over the material universe would finally fall. But something happened on that bridge that changed everything. Accounts vary on the exact details, for the events on the Vengeful Spirit were recorded by very few witnesses, and those who survived were not always in a state to provide reliable testimony. The traditional version of events holds that a lone figure, an ordinary human being with no superhuman abilities or warp-spawned power, stepped between the fallen emperor and the towering form of Horus, placing themselves in the path of the War Master's killing blow. In the oldest tellings, this figure was a simple soldier of the Imperial army, a man named Olanius Pius, whose courage in that moment has become the most enduring legend of the age of the Imperium. In other accounts, it was a custodian, or a space marine, or even one of the ancient perpetuals, the immortal beings who had walked the earth since its earliest days. The novels of the Siege of Terra series expand this moment significantly, placing the perpetual Olanius person on the bridge alongside other key figures such as Garviel Loken, the former Sons of Horus captain who had remained loyal to the Emperor, and others whose presence carried symbolic weight. What is agreed upon is this: whoever it was that stood before Horus, they were destroyed utterly. The War Master, irritated by this interruption, annihilated the figure with a casual exertion of power that reduced them to ash in an instant. But that act of casual cruelty accomplished something that years of war and millions of deaths had not. It showed the Emperor, in a moment of crystalline clarity, exactly what Horus had become. Not a fallen son who could be redeemed, but a vessel of absolute malice, a being for whom the destruction of an innocent was not even worthy of consideration. In that moment, the Emperor finally let go of his hope, and with hope went restraint. The full power of the Emperor of mankind, unleashed without reservation or mercy, was something that the galaxy had never witnessed and would never witness again. It was a force that existed beyond the comprehension of mortal minds, as a psychic detonation of such staggering magnitude that it ripped through the layers of warp power that shielded Horus and struck at the core of the being that had once been his son. There is a detail about this final moment that the most recent accounts have revealed, a detail so terrifying in its implications that it reframes the entire conflict in a new and darker light. In the moments before he unleashed his killing blow, the Emperor came perilously close to falling to chaos himself. The rage and grief of watching his sons die, of seeing everything he had built turn to ash and blood, nearly drove him to reach for the power of the warp in a way that would have transformed him into something called the Dark King, a fifth chaos god born from the accumulated suffering of the heresy. Had the Emperor taken that power, he would have had the strength to defeat Horus with ease, but the cost would have been the corruption of the last and greatest champion of humanity, the transformation of the Emperor from humanity's protector into its final destroyer. It was, according to these accounts, the intervention of Olanius Person and the other perpetuals on the bridge that helped the Emperor pull back from the edge of that abyss. Not through force of arms, but through the simple act of being there, of reminding the Emperor what he was fighting for. Not vengeance, not power, not even victory, but the preservation of something worth preserving, the spark of human potential that no amount of suffering could extinguish as long as there were beings willing to stand up and protect it. The Emperor chose not to become the Dark King. He chose to remain what he was, unflawed and finite and in pain, rather than become something that was powerful and eternal and monstrous. And in making that choice, in choosing the hard path over the easy one, the sacrifice over the shortcut, the Emperor demonstrated the very quality that he had always believed defined humanity at its best. The choice to be better, the choice to endure rather than to conquer, the choice to burn brightly and briefly, rather than to burn forever in the service of darkness. In some versions of the tale, the Emperor's killing blow was only able to pierce Horus's defenses through the crack in the War Master's armor, that Sanguinius had created before his death. Even in death, the great angel served his father. Even in death, loyalty endured. The lance of pure psychic energy tore through Horus's body and obliterated his soul. Not merely killed him, but destroyed the very essence of what he was, burning away the chaos, corruption, and the mortal consciousness alike until nothing remained but empty smoking armor. In the last instant before death claimed him, the accounts say that the chaos gods withdrew their power, and Horus, the real Horus, the son the emperor had loved, surfaced for one brief, terrible moment. He looked at his father with eyes that held recognition and regret, and shed a single tear. Then he was gone. The death of Horus sent a psychic shockwave through the traitor forces that was felt across the entire Sol system and beyond. On Terra, the demonic legions that had been rampaging through the palace corridors simply ceased to exist, their physical forms dissolving as the chaos gods withdrew their power in the wake of their champion's destruction. The traitor legions, already fractured by internal rivalries and the degradation of their command structure, collapsed into chaos. The moment of Horus's death was experienced differently by every being on Terra, depending on their nature and their allegiance. For the loyalist defenders, it manifested as a sudden, inexplicable lifting of the spiritual weight that had been pressing down on them for months. The constant psychic background noise of chaos corruption, the whispers and the dread and the gnawing sense of hopelessness that had been as much a weapon of the siege as any bolter or bombardment cannon, simply stopped. It was as if someone had opened a window in a room that had been sealed for months, and fresh air was rushing in to replace the stale, poisoned atmosphere of despair. For the mortal soldiers in the trenches, many of whom had been fighting in a state of spiritual exhaustion so profound that they had ceased to feel anything at all, the effect was almost overwhelming. Men and women who had not wept in months, who had shut down their emotional responses as a survival mechanism against the constant horror of the siege, suddenly found themselves crying without understanding why. Others laughed, or screamed, or simply sat down where they stood and stared at nothing. The sudden absence of the warp's oppressive influence, leaving a vacuum that their traumatized minds did not immediately know how to fill. For the demons, the never-born entities of the warp that had been manifesting in increasing numbers throughout the palace, as the death of Horus was a catastrophe beyond measure. The War Master had been the conduit through which the Chaos Gods projected their power into the material universe, and with his death, that conduit was severed. The power that sustained the demons' physical forms evaporated, and they began to dissolve, screaming and clawing at reality as they were dragged back into the Imperium. Greater demons who had been leading the assault on the inner palace simply vanished, their absence creating sudden gaps in the traitor lines that the stunned loyalists were initially too shocked to exploit. For the Blood Angels, the death of their Primarch's killer triggered something far more primal and far more lasting. Across the battlefield, Blood Angels who had been fighting with the disciplined fury that characterized their legion suddenly snapped, their consciousness overwhelmed by a flood of psychic energy that carried within it the echo of Sanguinius's final moments. They saw what their father had seen. They felt what he had felt. The agony, the grief, the defiance, the love, all of it crashed through their minds in a psychic tsunami that destroyed the barriers between their own identity and that of the angel in his last moments of life. The result was carnage. Blood Angels threw themselves at the retreating traitors with a savagery that shocked both loyalist and traitor marine alike, their weapons moving with a speed and strength that exceeded even their normal superhuman capabilities. They screamed as they fought, but the screams were not their own. They were the angels' screams. Sanguinius's final cry of defiance echoing through the gene seed of his sons, like a curse that would never be lifted. This was the birth of the Black Rage, though it would be centuries before the Blood Angels understood the full nature of what had been visited upon them. In that moment, they knew only that something inside them had broken, and that the breaking had released a fury that was as beautiful as it was terrible. The sons of Horus, feeling their Primarch's death like a physical blow, broke from the siege immediately and were the first to flee. The World Eaters dissolved into incoherent bands of berserkers who were easy prey for the rallying loyalists. The Emperor's children, who had largely abandoned the siege to pursue their own depraved interests among the civilian population, scattered like startled predators. Whilst Mortarion and the Death Guard, still reeling from the Khan's banishment of their Primarch, were the last to withdraw, their retreat as methodical and unhurried as everything they did, even in defeat. The retreat of the traitor legions from Terra was not the orderly withdrawal of a defeated army, but the disintegration of a force that had lost its reason for existing. Without Horus, the alliance that had held 9 legions together, an alliance that had always been more a marriage of convenience and shared resentment than any genuine unity of purpose, fell apart completely. The rivalries and hatreds that the War Master's authority had suppressed erupted to the surface, and in some cases, traitor forces turned on each other even as they fled from the loyalist counterattack. The World Eaters were the worst affected. Angron's legion had already been deteriorating into mindless savagery for months, the butcher's nails implanted in their brains, driving them to ever greater heights of berserker fury, while simultaneously destroying their capacity for rational thought. Without Horus's strategic direction to channel their violence toward productive ends, the World Eaters simply attacked whatever was nearest, which often meant their own allies. Bands of white and blue armored berserkers rampaged through the traitor siege lines, cutting down cultists, mutants, and even members of other traitor legions with the same indiscriminate fury they had directed at the loyalists hours before. The Iron Warriors withdrew in far better order, Perturabo's cold discipline maintaining cohesion even in the midst of the general collapse. The Lord of Iron had seen the writing on the wall long before Horus's death, and his contingency plans for withdrawal were as meticulously prepared as his assault strategies had been. The Iron Warriors fell back in stages, maintaining defensive formations that discouraged pursuit, and they were among the few traitor forces to exit the Sol system with their organizational structure largely intact. This discipline would serve them well in the millennia to come, as the Iron Warriors remained one of the most dangerous and coherent traitor legions throughout the long war that followed. The Night Lords, true to their nature, melted into the shadows and vanished. The 8th Legion had never been fully committed to the siege, their hit-and-run approach to warfare making them ill-suited to the grinding attrition of a prolonged siege. I'd left behind them a trail of murdered sentries and sabotaged defensive positions, petty acts of spite that served no strategic purpose, but satisfied the Night Lord's fundamental need to inflict suffering, even in the moment of their defeat. The Word-Bearers elements under Zardu Layak were among the last organized traitor forces to withdraw, though their leader did not survive to see the retreat. Layak had been killed by Rogel Dawn during the fighting for the Lion's Gate spaceport, the Praetorian's blade ending the Dark Apostle's life in a brief but decisive duel that removed one of the most dangerous sorcerers from the traitor ranks. Without Layak's direction, and the Word-Bearers' ritual activities ceased, and the weakening of the veil between reality and the warp that their ceremonies had been sustaining began to reverse itself. Angron, the demon Primarch of the World Eaters, was one of the last to leave. It is said that the Red Angel took one final longing look at the Imperial Palace that the traitors had come so close to seizing before boarding his transport and departing Terra. Whether that look contained regret, frustration, or simply the berserker's hunger for a battle unfinished, no one can say. But those who witnessed it from the loyalist lines spoke of a moment of strange stillness in the midst of the chaos, as if even the incarnation of rage itself could be stilled by the sight of the prize that had slipped from his blood-soaked grasp. The orbital situation above Terra also shifted rapidly in the wake of Horus's death. The traitor fleet, like the armies on the surface, lost all coordination once the psychic shockwave of the War Master's destruction rippled through the command structure. Some ships immediately broke orbit and made for the system's edge, their captains prioritizing survival over any lingering loyalty to the cause. Others remained in position, their crews too corrupted or too confused to react to the change in circumstances, and these became easy targets for the loyalist fleet elements that had been waiting on the system's periphery for exactly this moment. Admiral Sue Casson, commanding from the Phalanx, ordered an immediate attack on the disorganized traitor fleet, and her ships fell upon the scattered enemy formations with a ferocity that reflected months of frustrated impotence. The Loyalist fleet had been forced to watch the siege from a distance, unable to intervene directly against a traitor armada that vastly outnumbered them. Now, with the enemy fleet in disarray and reinforcements approaching from the system's edge, the Loyalist ships finally had the chance to make their contribution, and they did so with devastating effect. Traitor vessels were destroyed by the score, their crews too disoriented to mount effective defenses, their officers too demoralized or too dead to coordinate a response. The arrival of Corzane's Dark Angels fleet, followed shortly by the vanguard of Gilliman's Ultramarines armada, turned the rout into a massacre, as the traitor ships that had not already fled found themselves caught between the oncoming Loyalist reinforcements and the re-energized Sol System defense fleet, and the slaughter that followed was one of the most one-sided naval engagements of the entire heresy. By the time the last traitor vessel had either fled the system or been destroyed, the space above Terra was littered with the wreckage of thousands of ships, a graveyard of metal and frozen atmosphere that would orbit the throne world for centuries as a silent memorial to the greatest battle humanity had ever fought. On the bridge of the vengeful spirit, Rogel Dawn arrived at last, the Praetorian of Terra, the architect of the Imperial Palace's defenses, the man who had borne the weight of the entire siege upon his shoulders, and stood in the doorway and looked upon a scene of devastation that would haunt him for the rest of his existence. Sanguinius lay where he had fallen, his great wings broken, his beauty preserved even in death, the serenity of his expression suggesting that he had found, at the end, the peace that his visions had denied him in life. Dawn had loved Sanguinius. All the Primarchs had loved Sanguinius, even those who claimed to love nothing. The sight of him dead on the bridge of the traitor flagship cracked something inside Dawn that would never fully heal, a fracture in the Praetorian's iron discipline that would deepen and widen in the years to come until it consumed him entirely. And there was the Emperor. The master of mankind lay broken and barely alive, his golden armor shattered, his body ravaged by wounds that went beyond the physical and into the psychic fabric of his being. His remaining energy had been spent in the effort of destroying Horus completely, and what remained was a being sustained more by will than by any biological function. The Emperor's eyes found Dawn, and the Praetorian saw in them something he had never seen before and would never see again. Pain beyond description. The agony of a father who had been forced to destroy his own son, who had watched his dream for humanity die in the same moment that he ensured humanity's survival. The Emperor spoke. His voice carried on psychic currents rather than physical breath, each word costing him more effort than the siege itself had demanded of his mortal defenders. "Take me home. Carry me to the Golden Throne. There is still work to be done." The Emperor spoke his final conscious words to Dawn, simple words, urgent words, carrying the weight of 10,000 years of consequence. "Take me to the Golden Throne." Dawn obeyed. The surviving Loyalists teleported from the vengeful spirit back to the Imperial Palace, carrying the body of their Emperor with the reverence and the grief of those who understood that what they were witnessing was not a rescue, but a funeral procession for the living. In the throne room, they found Malcador. The sigillite was barely recognizable. The effort of holding the Golden Throne had consumed him utterly, reducing his body to a withered husk that crumbled at the edges, psychic energy lashing across his shriveled form like lightning across a dead tree. He had held on for hours that felt like centuries, pouring every last reserve of his being into the task of keeping the webway gate shut and the demons at bay. His mind had been invaded by Horus, by Magnus, by the chaos gods themselves, each one trying to break his concentration and shatter the last defense protecting Terra from annihilation. But Malkador had held. The old man, the mortal man, the first lord of Terra, had held against the combined assault of gods and demigods, and he had not broken. As the Emperor was placed upon the golden throne and the life support mechanisms engaged, Malkador released his grip on the throne's power and allowed himself to die. His body, drained of all moisture and vitality, crumbled to dust in moments. The first lord of Terra, the man who had helped build an empire that spanned the stars, who had founded the institutions that would govern humanity for 10,000 years, who had recruited the Knights Errant, who would become the Grey Knights and the Inquisition, was gone. His physical form ceased to exist, reduced to nothing more than a fine grey ash that settled on the golden surface of the throne like a final silent blessing. The death of Malkador the hero is one of those events that the official histories of the Imperium have never fully reckoned with, perhaps because the implications are too unsettling for the institutions that govern in the Emperor's name. Malkador was not a Primarch. He was not a Space Marine. He was not a product of genetic engineering on the scale that produced the Emperor's superhuman sons. He was, at his core, a human being, albeit an extraordinarily old and powerful one. And his willingness to sacrifice himself for the Imperium demonstrated something that the more spectacular heroics of the Primarchs sometimes obscured. That ordinary humanity, for all its fragility, was capable of a courage and a devotion that matched or exceeded anything the Emperor's engineered creations could achieve. In the millennia since his death, Malkador has become a figure of almost mythical significance within the Imperium's secret histories. The Inquisition, the institution he conceived, reveres his memory as the archetype of the vigilant servant, the watchful guardian who sacrifices everything to protect those who will never know his name. The Grey Knights, the secret chapter of Space Marines created from gene seed that Malkador helped select and purify during the final days of the heresy, will carry his legacy in their blood and their purpose, each one a living monument to the Sigillites' vision of warriors who could stand against the worst the warp could manifest and remain uncorrupted. Perhaps the most fitting tribute to Malkador is the simplest one, the fact that the Imperium endured. For all its flaws, the Imperium of man survived. Humanity was not consumed by chaos, and that survival owes more to Malkador the Sigillite than most of the Imperium's citizens will ever know. But before the last spark of his consciousness faded, Malkador managed one final act. He transferred the remnants of his psychic energy to the Emperor, providing just enough power for the Master of Mankind to awaken briefly and deliver his final instructions before the Golden Throne claimed him forever. The Emperor spoke to those gathered around him, his voice a whisper that carried the authority of a god. He gave instructions for the governance of the Imperium, for the continuation of the war against chaos, for the structures and institutions that would guide humanity through the darkness that was to come. And then the Golden Throne activated fully, its systems engaging the stasis fields and psi-fusion reactors that would sustain the Emperor's physical form in a state between life and death for the next 10,000 years. The Emperor of Mankind, the being who had united Terra, conquered the galaxy, and saved his species from extinction at the very moment of its greatest peril, was silenced. The most powerful voice in the galaxy fell still. And the silence that followed was the silence that would define the Imperium for the next 100 centuries. Think about that for a moment. Oh, the silence. For 10,000 years, the Emperor has not spoken, has not laughed or cried or shared a meal with a friend or looked upon a sunset and found it beautiful. He has not held his sons or told them he was proud of what they had accomplished. He has not explained himself or apologized for his mistakes or offered comfort to the billions who pray to him every day. He simply endures, in silence and in agony, the most powerful mind in the galaxy, trapped in a body that is neither alive nor dead, sustained by machines that even the brightest minds of the Mechanicus no longer fully understand. Every day, every single day, for 10,000 years, 1,000 psykers are sacrificed to fuel the Golden Throne. Their souls are burned away to provide the energy that keeps the Emperor's body functioning and the Astronomicon burning. 1,000 lives, each one with its own hopes and fears and dreams, consumed in an instant to buy one more day of the Emperor's agonized existence. The mathematics of that sacrifice are staggering. 365,000 psykers per year, 3.5 billion over the course of a millennium, 35 billion in 10,000 years, if you do not account for the fact that the throne's appetite has grown over the centuries, demanding more and more fuel to maintain its declining systems. That is the price. That is what the siege of Terra bought. Not salvation, not peace, not the bright future that the Emperor had envisioned when he launched the Great Crusade. Just survival. Just one more day, one more year, one more millennium of holding back the darkness by the barest margin, as paying for each moment with sacrifice on a scale that defies moral comprehension. And yet, for all its grimness, the Imperium endures. That is the legacy of the siege of Terra. Not the heroism, though there was heroism in abundance. Not the sacrifice, though the sacrifice was beyond measure. The legacy is endurance. The stubborn, bloody-minded, occasionally noble, frequently terrible, always costly refusal to stop existing. The aftermath of the siege of Terra shaped the galaxy in ways that are still felt 10 millennia later. The traitor legions, broken and leaderless, fled toward the Eye of Terra, a massive warp rift in the galactic west where the laws of reality held no sway and the power of chaos could sustain them. The campaign to drive them out of Imperial space, known as the Great Scouring, it lasted for years and was led by the surviving loyalist Primarchs, principally Robert Guilliman, who had arrived too late to save Terra, but in time to ensure that the traitors would never threaten the throne world again. Rogel Dawn, the Praetorian who had borne the heaviest burden of the defense, never recovered from the experience. The knowledge that he had stood within the same ship as his dying father and his murdered brother, that the defenses he had built with such care and precision had ultimately been insufficient to prevent the catastrophe, haunted him for the rest of his days. He entered the Pain Glove, a device of his own creation that subjected the user to agony as an aid to meditation, and when he emerged, he was a changed man. He would go on to lead the Great Scouring with a ferocity born of guilt and grief, as before eventually disappearing during the First Black Crusade, his fate unknown, his hand the only relic recovered from his final battle. Sanguinius was mourned as perhaps the greatest loss of the entire heresy. His death inspired the Blood Angels to a savage reprisal against the fleeing traitors that is believed to be the first manifestation of the Black Rage, the genetic curse that causes Blood Angels to relive their Primarch's final moments in battle, overcome by a fury so consuming that they lose all sense of self and become the angel in his last desperate fight against the monster that wore his brother's face. The Black Rage is perhaps the most haunting legacy of the Siege of Terra, because it demonstrates that the consequences of what happened on the Vengeful Spirit were not merely historical or strategic, but biological. It imprinted into the very gene seed of the Blood Angels at the moment of their father's death. Every Blood Angel who has ever lived since that day carries within them the echo of Sanguinius's final agony, a psychic wound so deep that it can surface at any moment, in any battle, transforming a disciplined warrior into a screaming, weeping avatar of grief and rage, who sees not the enemy before him, but the face of Horus, twisted with malice, standing over the broken body of the angel. Those afflicted by the Black Rage are gathered into the Death Company, a unit that is simultaneously the most feared and most pitied formation in the entire Imperium. They are given black armor, anointed with blood, and pointed at the enemy in the knowledge that they will fight until they are killed. and because the rage that consumes them knows no bounds and acknowledges no authority. Their chaplains watch over them with a mixture of reverence and sorrow, for these are warriors who are reliving the most terrible moment in their chapter's history, trapped in a psychic feedback loop that turns every battle into the bridge of the vengeful spirit, every enemy into the face of the War Master. For 10,000 years, the Blood Angels have carried this burden. For 10,000 years, the sons of Sanguinius have lived with the knowledge that at any moment, in any engagement, the Black Rage might claim them, stripping away everything they are and leaving only the Angel's final scream. It is a curse that no apothecary can cure, no chaplain can fully console, and no amount of faith or discipline can permanently suppress. And it all began on the bridge of the vengeful spirit, in the moment when Horus struck down the greatest of the Emperor's sons and unknowingly condemned his gene line to 10 millennia of torment. The custodians, too, bore scars from the siege that went beyond the physical. Constantin Valdor, the captain general of the Legio Custodes and the first among the Emperor's personal guardians, had fought through the siege with a determination that matched or exceeded that of any Primarch. The custodians had been created to be the Emperor's ultimate protectors, each one individually crafted to be superior to any Space Marine, and during the siege, they had fulfilled that purpose with devastating effectiveness. But the fall of the Emperor, the knowledge that their sole purpose in existence had ended in failure, that the being they had been created to protect was now trapped in a living death upon the Golden Throne, broke something in the custodians that 10,000 years have not fully repaired. After the siege, the custodians withdrew into the Imperial Palace and largely ceased engaging in external military operations, a self-imposed exile that lasted until the return of Reboot Guilliman in the 42nd Millennium. They became the Silent Watchers, the Golden Guardians who paced the corridors of the palace in eternal vigil over an emperor who could no longer speak to them, could no longer give them orders, could no longer reassure them that their purpose still had meaning. It was a form of penance, perhaps, or a form of mourning that was as much about what had been lost as about what still needed to be protected. Ivaldor himself disappeared in the aftermath of the heresy, his fate one of the great unsolved mysteries of Imperial history. Some accounts suggest he departed Terra on a mission of his own devising, pursuing threats that he alone perceived in the post-heresy chaos. Others hint at darker possibilities, that the Captain General, unable to reconcile his failure to protect the Emperor with his continued existence, chose to remove himself from the picture, in a way that remains deliberately ambiguous. Whatever the truth, Valdor's absence left a void in the custodians' leadership that would not be filled for millennia, and the shadow of the siege of Terra hung over the Legio Custodes like a golden shroud long after the last traitor had fled from the throne world. What the Jagatai Khan recovered from his wounds and led the White Scars during the Great Scouring before disappearing into the webway during a pursuit of the Dark Elder. The White Scars continue to await his return, believing that one day the Warhawk will ride again. Guilliman, who arrived too late for the siege itself, but in time to shape the Imperium that emerged from its ashes, took up the mantle of governance that the Emperor could no longer exercise. He wrote the Codex Astartes, restructured the Space Marine legions into smaller chapters to prevent any single leader from ever again commanding enough Astartes to threaten the Imperium, and established the institutions that would govern humanity for the next 10,000 years. For all his administrative genius, but Legions was, in many ways, the most controversial and far-reaching decision of the post-heresy era. The logic was sound. The Horus heresy had demonstrated beyond any doubt that concentrating the command of tens of thousands of superhuman warriors in the hands of a single individual, however noble their intentions, created a vulnerability that the enemies of mankind could exploit with catastrophic consequences. By breaking the legions into smaller chapters of approximately 1,000 Space Marines each, the Imperium ensured that no future rebellion could draw upon the same concentrated military power that Horus had wielded. But the trade-off was that the chapters, individually, were far less powerful than the legions had been, and the bonds of brotherhood that had made the legions such effective fighting forces were diluted by the division. Not all of the surviving primarchs agreed with Guilliman's reforms. Rogel Dawn, in particular, resisted the breaking of his imperial fists with a stubbornness that nearly led to a second civil war before he relented. Dawn saw the Legion system as fundamental to the identity of the Space Marines, and the idea of dividing the warriors he had led through the most terrible battle in human history was abhorrent to him. But Guilliman was persuasive, and the High Lords of Terra, newly empowered by the administrative structures that the Regent established, supported the reform. Dawn eventually complied, entering the Pain Glove to meditate on his decision, before emerging with the determination to lead the Great Scouring with the same unflinching dedication he had brought to the defense of Terra. The Great Scouring itself lasted for years, as the Loyalist forces systematically drove the traitor legions from their remaining strongholds in Imperial space. It was a campaign of vengeance and cleansing, driven by a fury that had been building for 7 years of civil war and 55 days of the most intense combat the galaxy had ever known. The Loyalists showed little mercy to the traitors they caught, and the traitors, knowing what awaited them if they surrendered, fought with the desperation of the damned. World after world was reclaimed, each one bearing the scars of the heresy in burned-out cities and mass graves, and the lingering taint of chaos corruption that would take generations to fully cleanse. The traitor legions retreated before the advancing Loyalists, falling back toward the Eye of Terra, a massive warp rift in the galactic southwest where the barriers between real space and the Imperium were so thin that the laws of physics held only a tenuous grip on reality. Within the Eye, the traitors found a refuge of sorts, though refuge is perhaps too generous a word for a place where time flows backward and reality reshapes itself according to the whims of beings that exist beyond mortal comprehension. The daemon worlds of the Eye of Terra became the new homelands of the traitor legions, or places of nightmare and mutation where the fallen Space Marines continued to wage their war against the Imperium across the millennia, launching periodic invasions known as Black Crusades that would test the Imperium's defenses again and again in the centuries to come. Ezekiel Abaddon, the first captain of the Sons of Horus and the War Master's most trusted lieutenant, would eventually rise to lead these Black Crusades as the new War Master of Chaos, though the title would carry a very different weight than it had in Horus's day. Abaddon's story, his 13 Black Crusades and his eventual success in destroying the fortress world of Cadia and tearing open the Great Rift that divided the galaxy in two, is a saga that extends far beyond the scope of the Siege of Terra, but its roots lie in those final, but desperate hours aboard the Vengeful Spirit, when a first captain watched his Primarch fall and swore an oath of vengeance that would take him 10,000 years to fulfill. Malcador the hero was remembered in the Imperium in the way that great servants are often remembered, in the institutions they founded, rather than in the memory of the masses. The Inquisition, the Grey Knights, the Administratum, the Officio Assassinorum, all bore his fingerprints, all carried his legacy forward into an age that would desperately need the protections he had put in place. And the Emperor sat upon the Golden Throne, neither alive nor dead, his psychic might still powering the Astronomicon that guided humanity's ships through the warp, his presence still holding back the tide of chaos that pressed against the boundaries of the material universe. 10,000 years of sacrifice, 10,000 years of silence, 10,000 years of an Imperium that worshipped him as a god, while he could no longer speak to tell them what he had wanted them to be. There is an irony in this that the scholars of the Imperium have wrestled with for millennia. The Emperor, who rejected divinity with every fiber of his being, who launched the imperial truth specifically to combat the superstitious worship that he believed made humanity vulnerable to the predations of chaos, became the most worshipped figure in the history of the species. The faith that he tried so hard to prevent, the religion that he saw as humanity's greatest weakness, became the glue that held the Imperium together in his absence. Billions pray to him every day, offering devotion to a silent god who never wanted to be one. And those prayers, fueled by the sheer faith of uncounted trillions, may themselves provide a kind of spiritual armor against the warp that the emperor's secular philosophy never could. Whether the emperor would have approved of the Imperium that exists in his name is one of those questions that have no answer and never will. The Imperium of man in the 41st millennium is a totalitarian theocracy, a place of unimaginable cruelty and oppression, where the individual has no value beyond their utility to the state, and where entire worlds can be consigned to destruction on the authority of a single inquisitorial seal. It is not the enlightened secular civilization that the emperor envisioned. It is not the golden age of reason and progress that the Great Crusade was supposed to build. It is a fortress, a prison, and a monument to 10,000 years of suffering, held together by faith and fear and the constant threat of annihilation. And yet it persists. It persists because on the walls of Terra, in the trenches and the bunkers and the shattered corridors of the imperial palace, ordinary people chose to stand against the darkness. They chose loyalty over survival, duty over comfort, hope over despair. They paid for that choice with their lives, millions upon millions of them, and the galaxy has never paused to thank them. But their sacrifice was not in vain, because the species they fought and died to protect is still here, still fighting, still refusing to yield. The siege of Terra lasted approximately 55 days, from the first orbital bombardment on the 13th of Secundus to the death of Horus aboard the Vengeful Spirit. In those 55 days, tens of millions died on Terra alone, with tens of millions more perishing in the naval engagements in orbit and across the Sol system. Heroes beyond counting gave their lives for a cause that most of them barely understood. The greatest empire the galaxy had ever known was shattered beyond repair, its golden promise replaced by the grim reality of a civilization under permanent siege. But humanity survived. The species endured. And in the depths of the imperial palace, on a throne of gold and agony, the being who had sacrificed everything to ensure that survival continued his endless vigil, his silent war against the darkness that would consume the galaxy if he ever let his guard down for a single instant. The siege of Terra was the crucible in which the Imperium of man was forged. Not the Imperium that the Emperor had envisioned, with its secular truth and its dream of a humanity free from the tyranny of gods and superstition, but the Imperium as it exists today, dark, oppressive, suffocating in its devotion to a figure who never wanted to be worshipped, held together by fear and faith and the stubborn refusal of a species to go quietly into the night. It is a grim legacy, an imperfect monument to an imperfect war, fought by imperfect beings for a cause that was, at its core, the most perfect thing any species can aspire to: survival, the right to exist, the defiance of saying to the darkness, not today, not ever, not while we still draw breath and hold a weapon in our hands. Every prayer whispered by every faithful servant of the Emperor, every battle fought against the enemies of mankind, every act of sacrifice and heroism and stubborn, bloody-minded defiance is an echo of what happened on Terra in those 55 days. The soldiers who manned the trenches and died by the millions. The space marines who held the walls against impossible odds. The primarchs who fought and bled and broke themselves against the forces of annihilation. The old man who sat upon a throne of fire and held back the darkness with nothing but his will. The angel who went to his death because loyalty demanded no less. The father who destroyed his most beloved son because the alternative was the end of everything. These are the echoes that sustain the Imperium. These are the stories that give meaning to 10,000 years of suffering. And as long as those stories are told, as long as someone somewhere remembers what was sacrificed on the walls of the Imperial Palace, humanity will endure. Because in the grim darkness of the far future, there may only be war, but there is also this, the memory of those who stood against the night, and the hope, however faint, that their sacrifice was not in vain. Let me leave you with one final thought. the Siege of Terra is often described as a tragedy, and it was. The death of Sanguinius, the fall of the Emperor, the destruction of the dream that the Great Crusade had represented. These are losses that can never be recovered and wounds that can never fully heal. But the Siege of Terra was also a triumph, the most extraordinary triumph in the history of our species. Because the defenders won. Against every possible odd, against an enemy that wielded the power of gods, yes, against betrayal from within and annihilation from without, the defenders of Terra held their ground and survived. They survived because of loyalty and courage and stubbornness and faith and all the other qualities that make humanity both the most frustrating and the most magnificent species in the galaxy. They survived because an old man agreed to sit on a throne of fire and die screaming so that his friend could face their enemy. They survived because an angel went to his death with his eyes open and his heart unbroken. They survived because a Khan dragged himself along a scythe blade to take one last swing at the enemy. They survived because 1,000,000 ordinary people picked up weapons they barely knew how to use and stood in the path of nightmares they could barely comprehend and held. That is the lesson of the Siege of Terra. Here, that is the truth that echoes through 10,000 years of darkness and suffering and war without end. That when everything is at stake, when the odds are impossible and the cause seems lost, and the darkness is closing in from every direction, the human spirit can endure, can persevere, can stand against the night and say, with a voice that shakes but does not break, I am still here, and I am not afraid. The Emperor protects, but the people of the Imperium also protect themselves. And in the end, that is what the Siege of Terra was really about. Not gods and demigods and supernatural powers, but people, ordinary, flawed, magnificent people who chose to fight rather than kneel, and who bought the survival of their species with the only currency that has ever truly mattered, their own blood, freely given. And that, my friends, is the Siege of Terra, the greatest battle in the history of the Imperium, the moment when everything changed and nothing would ever be the same again. If this story moved you, if you felt the weight of what was lost and the price that was paid, then I would be honored if you would hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Every subscriber helps us continue to bring you these stories from the grim darkness of the far future, and your support means more than you know. Share this with a friend who loves Warhammer 40k. Leave a comment telling me which moment of the Siege of Terra hit you the hardest, and I will see you in the next one. Until then, take care of yourselves, stay safe, and remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, but there is also us, and that perhaps is enough. The Emperor protects.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any, and yeah, sleep well.